The most feared man in Chicago caught her before she even knew she was falling. One second she was gripping the marble railing, the next she was pressed against a chest that felt like it was built from concrete and cold decisions, and the entire ballroom stopped breathing. Not because of her, because of him. Because Luca Moretti hadn't touched another human being with anything other than violence in longer than anyone could remember. And now he was holding a terrified girl in a borrowed dress like she was the only fragile thing he'd ever been trusted with. If you've ever wondered what happens when the most dangerous man alive realizes he finally has something to lose, stay until the end. Like this video and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Moms! The charity gala had been Thomas Whitmore's idea, which meant it was already a mistake before anyone put on their shoes. Thomas Whitmore, chairman of the Whitmore Foundation, donor of record to 3 city council campaigns, and a man whose entire existence was a performance of generosity he never actually felt, had decided that the annual gala needed to be held at the Grand Continental Hotel this year. Not the convention center, not the university ballroom. The Continental, with its imported marble floors and its sweeping central staircase that cascaded down from the mezzanine level like something ripped out of an old Hollywood film. The kind of staircase designed to make an entrance. The kind of staircase that made even confident people hesitate at the top. Elena Hartwell was not a confident person. She stood at the top of that staircase for 47 seconds before she moved. She counted. Counting was something she did when the air got thick and the noise got loud and the edges of the room started pressing in. A habit she'd developed somewhere around age 12, when her mother had explained that social anxiety wasn't an excuse for rudeness, and Elena had decided that mathematics was the only language she could trust in a crowd. 1, 2, 3. If she got to 100 without falling apart, she could stay. If she didn't reach 50, she was allowed to leave. She was at 31 and already thinking about the exit. The gala floor below her was a sea of dark suits and evening gowns, of catered champagne flutes and practiced laughter, of people who had been performing wealth and influence for so long, they'd forgotten it was a performance. Elena had never belonged in a room like this. She was here because her employer, Margaret Chen, owned a bookstore called The Marginalia on West Hubbard Street, and Margaret's late husband had once sat on the foundation's advisory board, which meant Margaret received 2 invitations every year and always gave one to whoever she felt needed it most. This year, Margaret had looked at Elena across a table covered in unpacked inventory, at the dark circles under Elena's eyes and the worn elbows of her cardigan, and said, "You're 26 years old and you eat lunch alone every day. Take the invitation." Elena had argued for 11 minutes. She'd lost. So here she was, in a dress she'd borrowed from her upstairs neighbor, Diane. A dark blue floor-length thing with a small tear at the left seam that she'd safety-pinned closed with 3 pins and was now praying held. At the top of a staircase she hadn't expected to be quite this steep. In heels she hadn't expected to be quite this slippery on polished stone. She put her left hand on the railing and took the first step. The railing was cold. The marble was colder. There were maybe 200 people below her and none of them were looking up, which should have been a relief. And it wasn't, because the awareness of them, the collective noise and heat and motion of them, was already building pressure behind Elena's sternum like a slow flood. Step 2. Step 3. The woman in the green gown 2 steps below her stumbled slightly, shoulder-checking Elena as she passed without looking back, and that was enough. Elena's left heel caught the edge of the step at the wrong angle. Her grip on the railing slipped on the polished brass, and for one nauseating half-second she was purely in free fall, body angled forward over 8 more steps of unforgiving stone, with nothing between her and the floor except velocity and embarrassment. She didn't scream. She didn't have time. What she hit instead was warmth. Solid, immediate warmth. 2 arms that came up from below and slightly to the right, with the kind of precision that didn't look like instinct, but had to be, because no one could calculate that fast. One arm caught her across the back. The other locked under her knees before her body had even finished the tilt. The momentum spun them both half a turn, but the arms didn't give, and Elena didn't fall, and the floor never reached her. She ended up cradled against a chest in a black jacket that smelled like cedar, and something colder, something she didn't have a word for. Not cologne exactly, more like the scent of a room that had been kept very quiet for a very long time. The ballroom went silent, not gradually, not the way sound normally fades when something unusual happens. All at once, like a switch, the way silence falls when people aren't just surprised, when they're afraid. Elena looked up. The man holding her had a face that was almost architecturally severe. Sharp jaw, slightly crooked nose that had been broken at least once and set imperfectly. Dark eyes that were currently looking at her with an expression that wasn't exactly warm, but wasn't cold either, which somehow made it more unnerving than either would have been. He was maybe 34, 35. Dark hair cut short at the sides. A jaw that looked like it had been formed by clenching teeth for approximately 2 decades. There was a faint scar at the left corner of his mouth, thin, old, the kind left by something sharp rather than accidental. He didn't look alarmed. He didn't look pleased. He looked like a man encountering a problem he hadn't anticipated and was already calculating the solution for, which Elena would later realize was just how Luca Moretti looked at everything. She didn't know his name yet. The room did. She heard it move through the crowd in a wave. Moretti. Hushed, the way people say the name of something that can hurt them, and she felt the temperature of the silence change from surprise to something more like held breath. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, not quiet, low, the kind of low that didn't need volume because it was already the loudest thing in the room by default. Elena opened her mouth, closed it. Her face was burning. The safety pins were still holding, which felt like the only victory available to her at this specific moment. No, I'm not hurt. I'm so sorry I lost my grip. The railing is..." She became aware that she was still in his arms. Became aware of that at approximately the same moment that every other person in the ballroom did. "You can put me down." He looked at her for one more second, long enough that she felt it like a physical pressure. And then he did. He set her on her feet with the same precision he'd caught her with, both hands briefly at her waist to make sure she was steady, and then they were gone. And Elena was standing on her own on the bottom step with 200 people watching her and her face the color of the emergency exit signs and absolutely nowhere to put her eyes. "Thank you," she said. She was looking at his second shirt button. "I'm sorry." "You already said that." "I know, Yes." A pause. Elena forced herself to look up. The dark eyes were still doing that thing, that assessment, that quiet calculation. And up close she could see that there was something exhausted behind them, something that had been exhausted for a long time and had stopped expecting relief. "Get a drink," he said. "Your hands are shaking." Then he turned and walked away, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts around something moving too fast and too certain to deflect, and Elena stood at the bottom of the staircase alone, her hands indeed shaking, her borrowed dress intact, her heart doing something complicated and unasked for in her chest. The woman next to her, 50s, diamonds at her ears, champagne in hand, leaned slightly in Elena's direction, without quite looking at her. "Do you have any idea who that is?" she murmured. Elena didn't. She was about to find out. His name had been a piece of Chicago's architecture for almost 15 years. Luca Moretti had inherited a fractured bleeding organization at 22 years old when his father, Domenico Moretti, died of a heart attack in the middle of a card game with 3 of the city's other power brokers, leaving behind debts, enemies, and a son who everyone in the room had underestimated. The underestimation lasted approximately 6 weeks. What came after it became the kind of story people told in low voices, in the kinds of rooms where the doors were always locked and the windows didn't face the street. He hadn't rebuilt his father's organization. He'd replaced it. Quietly, methodically, with the patience of a man who understood that the most durable kind of control wasn't the kind enforced by noise, but the kind built from obligation, from debt, from the slow accumulation of knowing more about the people around you than they knew about themselves. Chicago's criminal underworld had an ecosystem, and Luca had spent 15 years learning every vein of it until he wasn't just part of the ecosystem. He was its circulatory system. Money flowed where he allowed, power rested where he permitted, and men who threatened either tended to develop the kind of problems that kept them permanently occupied with their own survival. He was careful. He was patient. He was, by most available evidence, Not a man who caught falling women at charity galas and then stood there looking at them for a beat too long. Which was why Marco Vitelli, Luca's head of security, a broad, unreadable man who had been standing 4 feet to Luca's left when the incident on the stairs occurred, was now watching his employer from across the room with an expression he was keeping very carefully blank. Luca was standing by the east window with a glass of whiskey. He wasn't drinking. Watching the girl in the blue dress navigate the edge of the crowd. Watching in a way that Marco recognized as the kind of watching Luca did when he was still thinking about something that should have already been filed away and finished. Marco said nothing. He'd been with Luca for 11 years. He knew the value of saying nothing at the right moment better than most people knew anything. What? Elena found the least populated corner of the room, which was near the service entrance, and stood there with a glass of sparkling water. She didn't drink, couldn't afford to blur her edges in a room like this, and tried to reorder herself. The problem with social anxiety was that it didn't respond to rationality. She knew, objectively, that almost no one in this room was paying attention to her. She knew that the incident on the stairs had already been replaced in most people's attention by whatever the next thing was. She knew that she was safe, that she was standing still, that the exit was 30 feet to her left and she could use it at any time. Her nervous system did not find any of this compelling. What her nervous system was doing was cataloging the number of people within a 10-foot radius, 7, the decibel level of the nearest conversation cluster, too loud, the temperature differential between the main room and this corner, slightly cooler, tolerable, and the location of the man in the black jacket who had caught her and then assessed her with those exhausted, calculating eyes and told her to get a drink because her hands were shaking. He was standing by the east window. She wasn't looking at him directly. She had a kind of peripheral awareness of where he was that she couldn't fully explain and wasn't interested in examining. A voice to her left. "You're the girl from the stairs." She turned. Young man, maybe her age, suit that didn't fit perfectly, champagne in hand, and the particular looseness of someone who'd had 2 glasses faster than intended. He had an open, friendly face and the energy of someone who collected social connections the way other people collected stamps. "I'm Elena," she said, because there wasn't a better answer. "Derek Vasquez, you know who that was? The guy who caught you?" "Someone mentioned a name. I didn't—" "Luca Moretti." Derek said it the way the woman with the diamonds had said it, with a specific texture, like the name itself required handling. As in the Moretti, as in half the city's infrastructure runs on money he decides where to put, as in there are people who've been in this city their whole lives who've never been in the same room as him, let alone— He stopped, glanced at her. "You really don't know who he is." "I work in a bookstore," Elena said. "That's not really— you don't have to work in finance to know who—" He looked at her face more carefully. "You genuinely don't know." "I know the name now." He doesn't come to things like this. He never comes to things like this. Him being here tonight is already a story. Him catching no offense, but him catching anyone like that, in public, where everyone could see it, Derek drank from his glass. That's going to be talked about. That's already being talked about. Elena looked at her sparkling water. "I just fell." "Yeah," Derek said. "That's kind of the point." "What?" She left 40 minutes later, which felt like a victory of discipline over instinct. Instinct had been screaming at her to leave within the first 15 minutes. She collected her coat from the check without incident, made it through the lobby and through the revolving doors and out into the night air of Michigan Avenue, and she stood on the sidewalk and breathed. November in Chicago. Cold with a specific kind of clarity to it, the kind that only exists when the lake wind has been doing quality control on the air all day. Her breath made a small cloud. The city noise, traffic, a siren 3 blocks north, the muffled bass line from something across the street, settled around her like a familiar blanket. She was better out here. She was always better out here. She'd already decided she was walking to the bus stop on Wabash when she heard footsteps behind her, and the night suddenly changed texture. "You left early." She turned. He was standing 6 feet back, not close enough to crowd, hands in his jacket pockets, which struck her as odd. She'd expected him to have a bodyguard attached to his elbow at all times. And there was someone behind him at a distance, a large man in a dark coat, but far enough back to be invisible if you weren't looking. She blinked, I was ready to go. The gala runs until midnight. I know when it runs until. A very brief silence. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite amusement, not quite surprise, but an acknowledgement of something, as if she'd passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. Are you always this direct? He asked. Elena almost laughed, which surprised her. I'm the opposite of direct. I'm the most indirect person you'll probably ever meet. You said something, and the obvious response was what I said. I'm not trying to be... She stopped. This is a strange conversation. Most of my conversations are strange. I believe that. She looked at him more carefully now that she was outdoors, where the light was worse, but the pressure was less. The exhaustion she'd seen in his eyes earlier was still there. He was looking at her with the same assessing attention as before, and it should have been uncomfortable, and it was slightly, but underneath the discomfort was something she didn't immediately have a name for. Curiosity, maybe. The sense that she was being perceived rather than just looked at. Nobody looked at Elena that way. She was a woman who had perfected the art of being easy to overlook. You work in a bookstore, he said. Did someone tell you that? I asked. She absorbed that. The Marginalia, West Hubbard. I've been there 4 years. What kind of books? The question surprised her enough that she answered it honestly before she could calibrate the answer. Depends on the day. Tonight I'd want something quiet, something with a small cast and no one dying for at least the first 100 pages. And usually? Usually I want something where somebody wants something badly enough that it changes them. That's really all a story is when you strip it back. Someone wants, someone changes. Everything else is decoration. She heard her own words land in the space between them and felt the familiar heat of having said too much, of having handed something real to someone who hadn't asked for it. She was about to deflect, about to make the self-deprecating retreat she usually made, when she realized he was still listening, not politely, actually listening, in the way that meant the words had gone somewhere rather than bounced off. I should go, she said. I have work tomorrow morning, and you should probably go back in. I'm not going back in. Oh, my car is here. He said it in a way that was almost an offer and almost wasn't, careful enough that she could decline it without it becoming a thing. She took a small breath. The bus is fine. I take it every night. All right. She started walking. She got maybe 4 steps before she stopped herself, because the thing about social anxiety was that it was anxiety, not rudeness, and she'd been raised by a mother who drilled the distinction between the two into her until it stuck. She turned back. Thank you, she said. For earlier, that was a bad staircase. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, maybe, or the memory of what a smile used to look like on that face before whatever had made it forget. Be more careful on stairs, he said. She turned and walked to the bus stop. She didn't look back. But she was aware, with the precision of someone whose nervous system had always been tuned too high, that he was still standing there until she turned the corner. Margaret Chen was at the register when Elena came through the door at 8:47 the next morning, 14 minutes late, which was unusual because Elena was almost never late. Margaret was 61, sharp-eyed, and constitutionally incapable of minding her own business in any situation she found personally interesting. She took one look at Elena's face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing happened." "You have the face you get when something happened." Elena put her bag down under the counter and started unwrapping her scarf. "I almost fell down the stairs at the gala, and someone caught me. It was embarrassing and fine. That's the whole story." Margaret was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to mean she'd heard more than the words. "Who caught you?" "Someone named Moretti." Elena said it neutrally. "Luca Moretti." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the one before it. Margaret set down the pen she'd been holding. "Elena." "I know. The man in the bar last night explained it to me. Luca Moretti caught you, in front of the whole gala. He happened to be standing there. It wasn't..." "Honey," Margaret leaned forward on the counter in a way that meant she was about to say something she'd decided was necessary rather than comfortable. "I've lived in this city for 40 years. I know what that name means. I knew what it meant when Thomas Whitmore was still nervous about the zoning commission. Whatever happened last night, It's fine. It was an accident. But you should understand what kind of... The bell above the door rang. Both women looked up. The man in the black jacket from the night before was standing in the doorway of a bookstore on West Hubbard Street at 8:49 in the morning. He was wearing a different jacket, dark gray, no tie. Behind him, the broad security presence from the night before was visible through the glass, stationed on the sidewalk with his hands at his sides and the particular stillness of a man paid to wait. Luca Moretti looked at Elena. He looked at the bookstore around him, the floor-to-ceiling shelves, the handwritten recommendation cards clipped to the spines, the mismatched armchairs, the smell of old paper, and the specific silence of a room where people came to be alone together. And his expression did something she hadn't seen it do the night before. It relaxed, just barely, just around the eyes. But it was there. "You said West Hubbard," he said. Elena became aware that Margaret had gone very still beside her. "This is a small bookstore," Elena said. "We don't really... we're happy to have you, but do you carry Hammett?" She blinked. "Dashiell Hammett?" "Yes." "Second shelf from the back, left side. We have the Maltese Falcon, Red Harvest, and the Thin Man. The Red Harvest is a first edition reprint worth more than it's priced, if you want my opinion." He walked toward the back of the store. Elena watched him go, then turned to find Margaret looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode. "He asked about Hammett," Elena said. "I can see that. He's just looking for a book." "No one," Margaret said very quietly, "who looks like that walks into a store like this for just a book at 8:40 in the morning." He bought all three. He stood at the back shelf for 4 minutes, taking each volume down, opening to random pages with the specific carelessness of someone who reads rather than someone who collects. And then he brought all three to the counter and set them down without the particular performance of wealth that Elena had been braced for. No show of not looking at the price, no gesture of indifference. He just set them down. She rang them up. Her hands were steadier than they'd been the night before, which she considered progress. "Red Harvest first," she said. "If you haven't read them, it's the one where his voice is the most unguarded. He was still figuring out how much he could make the prose carry on its own." He looked at her. "You've read all three?" "I've read everything we carry. That's the job." She paused. "Also, I read them because they're good. What else do you recommend?" She almost said nothing. The instinct to deflect, to minimize, to take up less space. She stopped it. "What are you looking for?" "I don't know. Something with a small cast." The words registered. Her own words from the night before returned to her. She felt the warmth in her face before she could prevent it. "That's cheap," she said. The corner of his mouth moved again, the almost smile. "Maybe. Does it work?" She turned and walked to the fiction section. She was very aware of him watching her move through the shelves with the ease of someone who knew exactly where every book in the room was. Because she did. Because this was the one room in the world where she was completely fluent. She pulled a novel from the shelf, slim, dark cover, dog-eared at the top corner, and brought it back. "Patricia Highsmith," she said. "Strangers on a Train. Small cast, moral complexity. Nobody does anything purely. You'll either love it or you'll find it frustrating because the protagonist makes choices that don't make logical sense." "What kind of choices?" "The kind people make when they want something they've decided they can't want." She heard herself and felt the heat rise again. "Anyway, it's good." He took the book. His hand briefly overlapped hers at the cover and then didn't, and neither of them acknowledged it. And Elena rang up the fourth book and told him the total, and he paid in cash, exact amount, and picked up the bag. At the door, he paused. "Tomorrow," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Elena looked at the bags of inventory that needed unpacking, at the stack of orders Margaret had left on the counter, at the small and manageable and completely comprehensible world of the marginalia that she had been inside for 4 years without anything unexpected happening. "We open at 9, she said. He left. Margaret appeared from the history section, where she had apparently been shelving books within earshot for the entire transaction. "Elena," she said. "I know. That man has..." "I know, Margaret. He's not a man you..." "I know." Elena picked up the nearest stack of inventory. "Can we open, please? It's Tuesday." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her own stack of books and started shelving without another word, which was the most worried Elena had ever seen her. He came back on Wednesday, and Thursday, and the following Monday. He never came at the same time twice. He never announced himself. He came through the door, walked to whichever section she was working in, and said, "What are you recommending?" Or I finished the Highsmith, or on one Thursday morning when he walked in while she was arguing with a distributor on the phone about a damaged shipment, he sat down in one of the mismatched armchairs near the window and waited without any visible impatience until she finished. She told herself this was strange, but harmless. She told herself this the way she told herself a lot of things, with the particular stubbornness of a person who had decided to disbelieve the evidence of their own instincts because the instincts were inconvenient. What she couldn't ignore was the quality of the conversations. He was a man who listened, not performatively, not the kind of listening that was just waiting for its turn, but the kind that had the texture of actual attention, of something being received and processed and reflected back with new weight. When she talked about books, she talked the way she always talked about books, without the social anxiety editing, without the constant internal assessment of whether she was taking up too much space, because books were the one subject where the editing process simply failed. She couldn't be guarded about Patricia Highsmith. She'd never found a way to do it. He asked questions that weren't small. Not what's your favorite book, but why do you think people keep reading stories where the person trying to do right thing ends up causing more damage than the person trying to do wrong? Not do you like working here, but what does it feel like to be in a room where everyone is inside their own world at the same time, not touching? She told him. She answered the way she almost never answered, without simplifying, without softening, without preemptively apologizing for the length or the complexity of what she was saying. And he listened, and he didn't flinch, and he told her in return, not equally, not with the same openness, but enough. Enough to sketch the outline of something behind the severe face and the exhausted eyes and the particular silence that seemed to follow him from room to room. She started learning his edges without meaning to, the way he went still when he was angry rather than loud, which was the opposite of what she'd expected, the way he never looked directly at the door when he entered a room but always knew where it was, the way he talked about the neighborhoods he'd grown up in, Bridgeport, 2 blocks from the park, with a specificity that meant he still walked there, still looked at those streets with the eyes of the boy he'd been rather than the man he'd become. She didn't ask him directly about his work. She didn't need to. The shape of it was present in every room he entered, in the way other people moved around him, in the conversations that stopped when he walked past, in the particular courtesy of someone like Marco, who was usually outside on the sidewalk, but occasionally came in and stood near the door with the neutral expression of a man who was there, and also wasn't. She knew what he was. She knew what the name meant. She had looked it up on the third night, sitting in her apartment above the dry cleaner on North Paulina, with the laptop on her knees and the winter rain against the window. What she found was a portrait assembled from implications rather than facts. No criminal record, because the kind of power Luca Moretti operated with was the kind that made criminal records a theoretical concern. A legitimate business portfolio that was too varied and too clean to be entirely legitimate. A reputation that moved ahead of him like weather. 3 newspaper mentions, 2 in the society section with photographs that caught him at the edge of frames, as if he were always aware of the camera angle and had decided to concede the minimum possible evidence of his presence. 1 in the Tribune's investigative series on organized crime in the city, referred to only as a figure believed to have significant influence over the West Loop distribution network. She'd sat with the laptop open for 20 minutes after that last one. Then she'd closed it and gone to sleep, because what she'd learned was something she'd already known, and knowing it more precisely didn't change the fundamental arithmetic. He was showing up at her bookstore. He was buying books. He was sitting in the armchair by the window and asking her questions about the relationship between moral ambiguity and narrative satisfaction. He was doing all of this in the mornings, before the city woke up enough to be watching. And she was not, as it turned out, afraid. She'd tried to be. She'd had the conversation with herself, the serious one, standing at the sink with the toothbrush going and her own eyes in the mirror. You know what he is. You know what people like him do. Fear is the appropriate response. The appropriate response to the most feared man in Chicago is to be afraid of him. But fear, as a practical matter, was a response to a perceived threat. And something about Luca Moretti, something she couldn't locate precisely. Something in the quality of the exhaustion behind his eyes, or the careful, almost reluctant way he seemed to handle things he found fragile, did not register to her nervous system as a threat. As a complication, yes. As something she wasn't equipped for, almost certainly, but not a threat. Oh, the fourth visit, a Wednesday, he arrived at 9:20 and found her in a standoff with the register's printer, which had jammed for the third time that week. "It's not personal," Elena said, not looking up from the machine. "It just... Here, hold this." She held out a small loop of jammed receipt paper without looking at who she was handing it to. He took it. She worked the jam free, reset the mechanism, tested the feed. It printed. She exhaled. Then she looked up and registered what she'd done. He was standing there with the receipt paper loop in his hand, expression caught somewhere between baffled and something that might, in a different face, have been the setup for a laugh. "Thank you," she said. "You handed me paper." "You're holding it, aren't you?" He set it on the counter. "You're not particularly impressed by me." "I'm impressed by people who finish a Hammett novel in 3 days and ask reasonable questions about it afterward," she said. "Are you?" "I told you the ending of Red Harvest is a structural argument, not just a plot point. The operative doesn't solve the problem, he becomes it. That's the whole..." "Yes," she said. "That's what I said when I recommended it." The almost smile again. Closer this time. She could see when she looked directly that his face was built for something more than what it usually did. The architecture was there for expressiveness, for warmth even, buried under years of controlled stillness. It surfaced briefly around his eyes when he was following a thought he found genuinely interesting and then receded. She was cataloging him. She recognized the process and couldn't stop it, because her brain cataloged everything. It was the same impulse that made her remember where every book in the store was and what condition the spine was in and when it had last moved from its place. She cataloged people the same way, quietly, without their knowing, building maps of them from the fragments they left in the air. He sat down in the armchair without being invited. He'd started doing that on the third visit, and she'd decided not to address it because addressing it would make it a thing when not addressing it kept it as just what it was, whatever it was. She brought him the book she'd been thinking about since the day before, Raymond Chandler, The Big Sleep. "Before you say it's a cliché," she said, setting it on the arm of the chair. "I wasn't going to." "You made a face." "I didn't make a face. You made the face you make when you're preparing to disagree with something before you've heard it." She sat down on the stool behind the counter, which was her standard position. "Marlowe is worth your time, not because he solves things. He doesn't, really, because he notices everything and still chooses to care about it, which is its own kind of exhausting and also its own kind of..." She stopped. He was watching her. Not the assessment from the first night, something different, something more attentive, more careful, as if he were reading something in her face the way she read spines on shelves. "Its own kind of what?" he asked. "Admirable," she said, "even when it doesn't work, especially when it doesn't work. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The bookstore's specific silence, which was the accumulated quiet of everyone who'd ever stood in it, needing the world to be smaller and simpler for a little while. "I fund 3 children's homes," he said. The statement arrived without context and without preamble, and Elena understood that it was precisely that he'd said it the way someone says something they've never said out loud before, without knowing until they've already said it why they're saying it now. She didn't respond immediately. She let it sit in the air the way it needed to. "In the city?" she finally asked. 2 in the city, 1 in Joliet. The one in Joliet was... There was a family that lost both parents in a car accident and 4 kids under 10, and the county placement system was... He stopped. The sentence had run somewhere specific, and he'd caught himself running toward it. "I made sure the kids stayed together." "That's not small," Elena said. "It's not talked about." "I'm not going to talk about it." Something moved in his face. That exhaustion again, but differently. Not the exhaustion of someone depleted, but the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and had, for exactly 1 moment, set it down. He opened The Big Sleep. She went back to the inventory. The shop filled slowly as the morning progressed, and he stayed in the armchair, reading, and none of the regulars paid him any attention he didn't invite, which was none. And Margaret appeared at 11 o'clock, looked at the situation, looked at Elena, and disappeared into the back room with a pot of coffee and the particular silence of a woman who has decided that what she doesn't witness, she can't be responsible for. He left at noon. He left the big sleep on the arm of the chair for her to reshelve, having finished the first 140 pages in just under 3 hours. "Next time," he said at the door. "We're open every day except Sunday," Elena said. He nodded. She watched the door close, watched Marco fall into step beside him on the sidewalk, watched the large black car idling at the curb take them both up and disappear into the noon traffic of West Hubbard Street. She stood at the counter for a moment. "Elena," Margaret called from the back. "I know," Elena said. "I'm not going to say anything." "Good. Except that I'm going to say one thing." Elena waited. "He looks at you like you're the only book in the store he can't read yet," Margaret said. "In my experience, that's either very wonderful or very dangerous." Elena looked at the armchair by the window, still slightly indented from his weight. "In my experience," she said, "those are usually the same thing." 3 weeks later, the story changed. She didn't know it was changing at first. She didn't feel the floor shifting the way you're supposed to in the movies, the slow, seismic warning that something is about to rupture. She felt instead the specific wrongness of a Friday morning that arrived with too many cars on West Hubbard Street, with two men she didn't recognize sitting in a sedan that had been parked across from the bookstore since 7 a.m., with Marco having a conversation on the sidewalk that ended when Elena stepped outside for her morning delivery, and both men looked at her with an expressionless attention that made her stomach drop 3 inches. Luca arrived at 9:15 with none of the settled ease he'd developed over the past weeks. He was moving differently. The precise, contained physicality that she recognized now as something he deployed when his attention was fully operational, the armor fully on. He came through the door and said, "Is anyone else here?" "Margaret doesn't come in until 10:30 on Fridays." Elena looked at him. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." "You're lying," she said, and regretted the word immediately, not because it wasn't true, but because she'd said it flat, without hedging, and to a man who was not accustomed to being told he was lying, but he didn't flinch. He looked at her steadily. "There are people watching this street," he said. "I noticed." How did you—" "The sedan across the street has been there since 7. The driver hasn't moved and there's no one in the shops over there before 9, and he has a coffee. He's not drinking." She paused. "I'm anxious, not oblivious. I notice when things are out of place." He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been reassessment. "They're watching me," he said. "Not you, but the fact that I've been—" He stopped. "This is a pattern. My presence here is a pattern. Patterns get observed." Elena understood the structure of what he was saying without him completing it. She felt the understanding land in her chest with a weight that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something much more complicated. "You're telling me to be careful," she said. "I'm telling you there are people who—" He stopped again, and the sentence sat unfinished in the air between them, and she could see him deciding, in real time, how much to complete it and how much to leave in the space where things that couldn't be said lived. She came out from behind the counter. She wasn't entirely sure why. The nervous system that had been on high alert since she'd seen those men outside had gone, paradoxically, quiet. The way it went quiet when she was standing among shelves and the world had contracted to paper and print and the specific logic of books on their spines. She stopped 2 feet from him. She looked at the scar at the corner of his mouth, the slight imperfection of the nose, the eyes that were doing the assessment again but differently than the first time, with something present in them that hadn't been there before, something that had been arriving slowly and that he had not, she thought, quite decided what to do about. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "I think I told you that. You've never said it directly. I'm saying it now." A silence. Outside, a truck passed on Hubbard. Somewhere in the back of the store, the heating system clicked on. "That's either very brave," he said, "or you don't understand what I am." "I know what you are." She held his gaze. Her hands were steady. She noticed that they were steady. "I also know that you read 3 Hammett novels and a Highsmith and a Chandler in 3 weeks and ask questions about all of them that weren't about plot, They were about what it means to want to be good in a world that makes being good expensive. She paused. So, something moved through his face. Something she'd never seen there before. Something that broke the surface and receded in the same moment. A rawness. A kind of fractured openness. The expression of a man who had been armored for so long that the one breach in the armor felt like catastrophe. He reached out and very carefully pushed a piece of her hair back from her face. Then he stepped back. 2 steps, deliberate, returning the distance between them to something manageable. "I'll stay away from the store," he said, "until this is resolved. Luca, it's safer." She wanted to argue. The argument was already formed. "I'm not asking you to. I can make my own decisions. What does safer mean in a city where you're the thing people are afraid of?" But she watched his face and understood that this wasn't about her and wasn't about books, and that the calculation he was running was one she couldn't fully see, and that whatever he was afraid of losing, it wasn't an argument. "How long?" she asked. "I don't know." She nodded. She went back behind the counter. She was very aware of the distance and what it contained. "There's a copy of Graham Greene's The Quiet American on the 3rd shelf," she said. "2nd row. It's been there for 2 years and it belongs to you, even if you've already read it. Leave money on the counter." A pause. "I've read it," he said, "but leave money on the counter anyway." She didn't look up. She heard him cross to the shelf, heard the whisper of the book pulled free, heard the specific sound of bills set on wooden counter, and then the bell above the door. She stood at the register for a long time after he left. Outside, the sedan was still parked across the street, and in Elena Hartwell's chest, something had changed its shape. Something she'd been calling curiosity, which she now understood was something else entirely, and which had been growing in the space between armchair and counter and early morning shelves and the ghost of an almost smile for weeks, and which had just been handed back to her by the most feared man in Chicago in the form of a book he'd already read. She was in trouble. She'd known it for days, but she knew it differently now. Knew it the way you know a thing when someone has finally said the quiet part out loud. Not with words, but with care, which was, she'd always believed, more honest than words anyway. Outside, a car started. The sedan, pulling away from the curb, slow and deliberate, watching. And Elena Hartwell stood in the small and manageable and entirely insufficient world of her bookstore, and understood that the world had just gotten larger whether she'd asked it to or not. She reached under the counter and counted the bills he'd left. $40 for a $7 paperback. She put 33 in the register. She folded the remaining 7 and held them for a moment, and then she put them in her pocket, and she opened the store for the day, and she waited. For what? She wasn't yet ready to say. But she was waiting. The sedan came back on Saturday. This time there were 2 of them. And this time, one of the men had gotten out and was standing on the sidewalk looking directly at the store when Elena opened the door to bring in the morning delivery. And she recognized, with the particular clarity of her nervous system's permanently overtuned radar, that the man was not watching the street. He was watching her. The man on the sidewalk had a paper coffee cup in his hand that he wasn't drinking from. Elena noticed that, first, the cup, and the way he was holding it at the wrong angle, tilted inward. The way you hold something when your hands need something to do, rather than when you actually want what's inside it. He was maybe 40, thick through the shoulders, wearing a jacket that was a shade too dark for the November morning, in the way that people sometimes dressed when they wanted to disappear into a background and had chosen the wrong background. He was looking at the store. He was looking at her. She picked up the delivery box from the stoop and went inside and locked the door behind her, which she didn't normally do until she'd finished the morning setup. Then she stood with her back against the door and the box in her arms, and her breath doing something shallow and quick that she recognized as the early edge of a panic response, and she counted. 1, 2, 3. By 15, she had it under control. Under control meaning still present, still audible in her chest, but manageable. A background noise rather than a foreground crisis. She put the box on the counter and looked at her phone. She had Luca's number. He'd written it on the back of a receipt on the 2nd week, not with any ceremony, just, "If the distributor gives you trouble again, call this." And she'd transferred it to her phone and not looked at it since, because looking at it too often felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make. She looked at it now. She put the phone face down on the counter and started opening the box with a box cutter, Because what she was not going to do was call a man she'd known for 3 weeks because a stranger was standing on the public sidewalk outside her place of employment. That was not a reasonable response. That was not who she was. The phone stayed face down for 4 minutes. Then she picked it up and typed, "There was a man outside the store this morning. Same car as yesterday. I thought you should know." She sent it before she could edit it into something smaller. The response came in 40 seconds. "Don't open until Margaret gets there. I'll handle it." She typed back, "I'm already open." A pause. Then, "Of course you are." She almost smiled. Then she thought about the man with the coffee cup and didn't. Marco arrived first, at 9:47, while Elena was helping the only customer who'd come in so far. An older man named Gerald, who came every Saturday for a large print mystery, and had been doing so for 3 years and was constitutionally unaware of anything that wasn't a mystery novel. Marco came through the door, swept the interior with a glance that was so practiced it looked like he was just looking at the shelves, and stationed himself near the history section with a book he'd pulled from the nearest shelf without reading the spine. Elena rang up Gerald's copy of an Agatha Christie reissue and watched Marco hold a book about the Byzantine Empire upside down and decided not to say anything. When Gerald left, she said, "You're holding it upside down." Marco looked at the book, turned it over, set it back on the shelf. "Mr. Moretti asked that you stay inside today," he said. "Mr. Moretti can ask things directly. He's dealing with something this morning." "What something?" Marco's expression did what Marco's expression always did, which was nothing. He was the most neutral-faced person Elena had ever encountered. Not cold exactly, but sealed, like a room that had been closed off so long that even the air inside had gone still. "The men outside," Elena said. "They've been moved." "Moved where?" "Away from here." She absorbed that. "Marco." "Miss Hartwell." "What's happening?" He looked at her for a moment with something behind the neutrality. Not warmth exactly, but the recognition that she was owed a response above the minimum. "There's a situation developing," he said. "Mr. Moretti is addressing it. In the meantime, it would be helpful if you stayed small and didn't ask questions." A pause. "I wasn't going to phrase it that way." "But that's the shape of it." "The shape of it," Marco said carefully, "is that Mr. Moretti would like you to be safe while he deals with something that doesn't involve you. The men watching this store involves me. They were watching the store because of patterns in Mr. Moretti's own movements. You are incidental." The word landed with more weight than he'd probably intended. Elena turned back to the register. "Tell him I'm fine," she said, "and tell him incidental is a strange word to use for someone he's been visiting every week for 3 weeks. Marco said nothing. But when she glanced up a moment later, she caught the edge of something in his face that might, under different circumstances and in a different face, have been the slight crease of a man acknowledging a fair point. Luca arrived at noon, He came through the back entrance, the delivery door on the alley side that Elena hadn't known he knew about until she heard the specific knock, 3 short, and found him in the narrow hallway between the storage room and the office, still in his jacket, with the particular quality of controlled stillness that meant he'd been moving fast before he'd made himself stop. "You're supposed to stay out front," he said. "This is my store," Elena said. "The back is also my store." He looked at her for a moment. There were marks on him. Not injuries exactly, but the evidence of a morning that hadn't been gentle. A slight tightness around the jaw that meant he'd been clenching it. A small cut on the back of his right hand, already clotted, that he clearly hadn't noticed or had noticed and decided wasn't worth attention. She looked at the cut. She looked at him. "What happened to your hand?" He glanced down. "It's nothing. There's a first aid kit in the storage room." Elena Payen. "There's a first aid kit in the storage room," she said again, in the same tone, which was not a raised tone, but the one that Margaret had once told her was much more effective than raising her voice, because it left no room for the other person to find a gap to push through. He followed her into the storage room. She found the kit on the second shelf, opened it, and took out what she needed without making a production of it. He sat on the edge of a shipping crate without being asked, the movement of a man who was accustomed to making himself fit whatever space he was given, which told her something about him that she filed away without fully examining. She cleaned the cut. It was shallow, a scrape more than a cut, the kind left by something with an edge rather than a blade. He said nothing during the process. His hand was very still in hers. She was aware of the size of it, the size of him generally, the way he took up space in the small room, not aggressively, but simply because the room wasn't built for someone with that particular density of presence. "The men this morning," she said, working the adhesive strip into place. "They work for a man named Vincent Caro." He said it flatly. "He runs a distribution operation out of the South Side. We've had a disagreement about territory, about money. Mostly about the fact that he made a move on a neighborhood I've kept stable for 7 years and seems surprised I noticed." "How bad is the disagreement?" He looked at her steadily. "Bad enough that he's having my movements tracked." "Bad enough that he's tracking me?" "He's not tracking you. He stopped. The jaw tightened. "He's identifying leverage. That's how men like Caro operate. They look for what you care about and they—" Another stop. The sentence had somewhere it was going that he wasn't going to let it go. Elena pressed the adhesive strip flat and released his hand. "And have they identified anything?" she asked. The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted. "I don't know yet," he said. It was not, she understood, a true answer. It was the answer he decided on, which was a different thing. And she knew the difference because she'd spent 4 years answering Margaret's questions with the answers she'd decided on rather than the true ones, and she recognized the architecture of it. She put the first aid kit away. She sat down on the other shipping crate facing him, close enough that the storage room felt like it was mostly them and very little room. "If they've identified me as leverage," she said, "I need to know. Elena, I need to know." He looked at her with the exhausted eyes, with the assessment, with the something that had been arriving slowly for weeks, and had, she thought, arrived. And the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen there before, something exposed and conflicted and almost angry, except the anger wasn't aimed at her but at the situation, at the particular geometry of having put someone in danger by caring about them, which was, she could see him working through it in real time, a thing he hadn't done in a very long time, if he ever had. "They know you exist," he said. "They know the store. They know the pattern." He looked at his bandaged hand. "It's enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough to make you a consideration." He looked up. "In their calculations." Elena let that sit for a moment. Outside the storage room, the shop sounds were normal. The heating system, a customer moving through fiction, Margaret's voice asking if someone needed help. Normal. Manageable. The world of the store. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Resolve it." "How?" "The way these things get resolved." She watched him. The controlled stillness, the sealed quality. But underneath it, when she looked at the precise angle, at the lines around his eyes and the set of his mouth, something that was not, she thought, as controlled as he wanted it to look. Something that was running a calculation with a variable he didn't have a clean answer for. "The way these things get resolved," she said slowly, "generally means more men with coffee cups outside my store. Or worse. It means the problem stops. It means violence." He didn't deny it. She hadn't expected him to. She looked at the first aid kit she'd just put away. She thought about the man at the gala who'd held her steady at the bottom of a marble staircase with the precision of someone who'd learned how not to let things break. She thought about the armchair by the window, and 3 weeks of early mornings, and Hammett, and Highsmith, and Green, and questions that weren't about plot. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," she said. "Good. I'm also not going to pretend I don't know what this is, what you are, what that means." She held his gaze. "But I'm not leaving the store. This is my job and my life, and I'm not going to disappear from it because someone is using me as a variable in their calculations. I refuse that." Something moved in his face. The fractured openness again, the breach in the armor, but held for longer this time, as if he'd decided to let it stay rather than pulling it back immediately. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met," he said. "I'm anxious," she said. Anxiety and stubbornness looked the same from the outside. He almost smiled. Almost. The closest it had come yet. The muscles around his eyes, the slight softening of the mouth. And then it was gone. And he stood up from the shipping crate, and he was back to the full controlled presence. "Marco stays on the block today," he said. "Marco can stay wherever Marco wants." "Elena." "I heard you," she said. "Marco stays, fine." She stood. Now come out front. Margaret's going to assume I've stored a body in here if we're in the back much longer. Margaret did not assume this, but she did look at Luca's bandaged hand and then at Elena with an expression of barely restrained inquiry that she maintained for the rest of the afternoon with the discipline of a woman who had decided that not knowing was currently the more comfortable option. Luca stayed for 2 hours. He sat in the armchair and read, not The Big Sleep, which he'd left the week before, but a James Baldwin novel Elena had pressed on him 3 days ago and which he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket since, the pages already soft at the corners. He sat and read, and the store moved around him the way water moves around a stone, with the stone's full awareness, and Elena worked the register and helped customers and organized the new arrivals. And it was strange, domestic, almost. Ordinary in a way that felt constructed, as if the ordinariness were a performance they'd both decided to give, knowing the audience was the situation itself. At 2 o'clock, his phone vibrated. He looked at it, stood, and put the Baldwin on the arm of the chair. Tonight, he said. She looked up from the register. What about tonight? There's a dinner. Whitmore Foundation, the quarterly thing. I'm expected. He said it with the specificity of obligation rather than desire. It's the kind of event where my absence would be noticed. So go. I'd like you to come. The sentence landed with the weight of something that had been prepared, that he'd been deciding on, and decided. Not a question, not exactly. The careful construction of someone who understood that he was asking for something that mattered. Elena looked at him. She thought about the last gala, the marble staircase, the borrowed dress, the crowded room, the 47 seconds at the top of the stairs. She thought about 200 people in formal clothes and the specific press of too many people in one room and the way her nervous system was already raising its hand preemptively. That's a crowd, she said. Yes. A big crowd. Yes. With cameras, probably. There will be photographers. Yes. She looked at the store, at the small and manageable dimensions of it, at the shelves that held their positions reliably, and the register that jammed predictably, and Margaret, who had never once in 4 years made Elena feel like she took up too much space. Why? She asked. He looked at her steadily. Because Caro's people will be there. Because if I walk in alone, they'll read the situation one way. If I walk in with... He stopped. Because I want you there, he said, and the sentence was different from the first explanation, simpler and more costly. That's the real answer. Elena picked up the inventory sheet she'd been working from and set it down again. I don't have anything to wear, she said. Not to a Whitmore dinner. That can be handled. I don't want things handled for me. Then tell me your size, and I'll tell you where to buy something, and you can handle it yourself. She almost laughed. Almost. You're very strange, she said. Most people don't tell me that. Most people are afraid of you. And you're not. I've said that. He looked at her for a moment, the full weight of it, the look she'd learned to hold rather than deflect. There's a shop on Michigan, he said. Tell them the account name is Arrowhead Holdings. They'll know. I'm paying for my own clothes. Elena. I'm paying for my own clothes, she said again, pleasantly and completely. And he looked at her the way she'd come to understand meant he was deciding whether to argue, and had concluded it wasn't worth the effort. 7:30, he said. I'll send a car. I can take a car, he said. Please. She recognized the please as something rare in his vocabulary and handled it accordingly. 7:30, she said. What's? The shop on Michigan was staffed by a woman named Irina, who took one look at Elena and said, without preamble, You're the bookstore. It wasn't a question. Elena decided not to investigate what it meant and bought a dark green dress that was simple and well cut and cost more than her rent, which she paid for herself because she'd said she would, and she always meant what she said. And the transaction cleaned out half her savings account, and she decided to think about that later. She was home at 5, dressed by 6:40, and standing at the window of her apartment at 6:50 watching the street. When her phone rang. Not a number she had. She answered anyway. Ms. Hartwell. A man's voice. Not young, not old. Unhurried. Yes. My name isn't something you need to know. I'm calling as a courtesy. Elena's hand tightened on the phone. I'm going to ask you a question, the voice said, and I'd like an honest answer. She said nothing. How important is Mr. Moretti to you? The cold in the question wasn't the cold of threat. It was the cold of someone who had already made a decision and was confirming arithmetic, which was worse. I don't know what you're... How important, the voice said again, patient and empty, is the bookstore to you, the woman who owns it, the life you've made on West Hubbard Street? Those things, how important are they? Elena's mouth went dry. I think about that tonight, the voice said. Before you go to the dinner, think about what you'd trade and what you wouldn't. And then ask yourself if a man in his position can afford to have a woman in yours. The call ended. She stood at the window with the phone in her hand for a long time. The street below was ordinary. Traffic, a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck double parked at the corner. Nothing watching, nothing out of place. She put the phone down. She put on her coat. She walked down the stairs and out the front door of her building and got into the car that was already waiting at the curb at 7:28. She did not call Luca on the way. She needed to think without his presence reorganizing her thoughts, which she had noticed it did. The way he took up the available attention in a room and left less space for everything else. She thought about what she'd trade and what she wouldn't. She thought about Margaret, who had given her a spare key to the store 4 years ago without ceremony, who had never once made her feel like a burden, who had handed her a gala invitation because she'd decided that Elena deserved something that wasn't small and manageable for one night. She thought about the voice on the phone and the specific temperature of it. Not angry, not cruel, just calculating. The way a man sounds when he's already decided the outcome and is simply collecting the remaining information. She thought about Luca in the storage room with a cut on his hand and the fractured openness behind the armor. The car pulled up to the Continental. He was waiting at the base of the entrance steps, which she recognized as intentional, not in the lobby, not at the table, but outside, where he'd have to have been standing for a while, in the cold, watching for the car. Marco was behind him at the standard distance, and there was another man she didn't know flanking the steps at the far side. She got out of the car. He looked at her for a moment. The green dress, her hair, the fact that her hands were not visibly shaking, which she was working at, and something moved through his face that she didn't have language for yet, something that was too direct to be the almost smile and too quiet to be surprise. "You came," he said. "I said I would." "You could have changed your mind." She looked at him. She'd made a decision on the drive over, in the silence of the car, the decision not to tell him about the phone call until after, until she'd had time to think about what it meant, what it was intended to do, whether it had done it. "I got a phone call," she said, because she'd also decided she couldn't lie to him, which was a different kind of decision. He went very still. "When?" "An hour ago. A man. He asked me how important you were to me." The stillness deepened. She watched the calculation move through him, the rapid, invisible processing of a man whose entire life was threat assessment. "What did you say?" "Nothing." He didn't wait for an answer. He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, the hotel entrance blazed with light, and the sound of the gala drifted out. Voices, music, the particular noise of a room full of people performing for each other. "You should go home," he said. His voice was different, stripped. "I don't think that's..." "Elena." The word arrived with weight, with something urgent and barely controlled. "If Caro called you directly, he's already..." "I know what he's already done," she said. "He's put me in the equation." "Then you understand why..." "I understand why you'd want me somewhere safe and small and out of the picture." She met his eyes. "I also understand that going home and disappearing is exactly what he's trying to get me to do. Because if I disappear, you're alone tonight, and whatever he's planning for tonight, that's not your Luca." She said his name the way she'd said it in the storage room, without raising her voice, without leaving gaps. "I'm already in the equation. Going home doesn't take me out of it. It just means I'm in it without being here." She paused. "So I'm here." He looked at her for a very long time. She saw the moment he stopped arguing, not because he'd been persuaded, but because he'd understood that she had processed the risk and made a choice, and that the choice was not going to change, and that underneath the fear for her, because she could see it now, had been able to see it for a while, the thing driving the controlled stillness, The particular quality of how he stood between her and the rest of the room, underneath it, was something that didn't know what to do with a person who chose toward him instead of away. He held out his arm. She took it. They walked up the steps and into the light and through the doors of the Continental Hotel, and the room turned, the way rooms turned for him. And this time when it turned for both of them. The dinner lasted 3 hours. Elena sat next to Luca at the main table and managed the crowd the way she managed every crowd, by making it smaller in her head, by focusing on the immediate circle of 2 or 3 people, by letting the larger noise become ambient rather than present. Luca, she discovered, was a different person at a table like this. Still precise, still controlled, but operating in a register she hadn't seen before. The register of a man who had learned to speak every language in the room and had chosen which ones to deploy and when with the care of a chess player who'd memorized the board. He was not warm with these people. He was functional. He answered what was asked, initiated nothing that wasn't necessary, and kept his attention. She felt it, the continuous quiet tracking of it, on the room and on her in equal and unequal measure. She managed. At the mid-dinner break, when the room broke into smaller groups for drinks, a man materialized at Luca's elbow, who Elena understood immediately was not supposed to be here. Not in the sense of the guest list, he was clearly on the guest list, but in the sense that Luca's body changed the moment the man appeared, the controlled stillness shifting into something below stillness, something that was already several calculations deep. The man was maybe 50, with the expensive casual ease of someone who'd been wealthy long enough that he wore it like a second skin. He smiled at Luca with the particular quality of a smile that was entirely performance. Luca, as if they were friends. Vincent, flat. So this was Caro. Caro's eyes moved to Elena with the unhurried assessment of someone who had already decided what she was and was simply confirming dimensions. And this must be the bookstore, he said pleasantly. Elena smiled at him. Her heart was doing something urgent behind her ribs. Her hands were at her sides, still, because she was not going to give him her shaking hands. Elena Hartwell, she said. Vincent Caro. He shook her hand with the particular firmness of a man who wanted you to feel the bones. Lucas told me nothing about you. I've read everything about you, Elena said, which was a lie. She'd read nothing about Vincent Caro. But it was the kind of lie that landed because it was the kind of thing that could be true, and she watched it land, watched the slight recalibration in his eyes. Interesting, Caro said. He looked back at Luca. I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk tonight. There are some, he paused, logistical questions. We've had that conversation, Luca said. I think there's more to say. I don't. The smile stayed in place with the mechanical persistence of something that didn't need genuine feeling to function. Well, Caro said, perhaps after dinner, I'm sure Ms. Hartwell won't mind lending you for a few minutes. He looked at Elena again. It was lovely to meet you. He moved away into the crowd with the unhurried ease of a man who knew he'd made his point. Elena waited until he was far enough, then said quietly, He called me. I know, Luca said. His voice was very low. I know. You knew before I told you. I suspected. When you said there was a call, I knew. She looked at the room, the chandelier, the white tablecloths, the circling servers with their trays, the performance of civility that the city's powerful staged for each other twice a year. What does he want? She asked. What he's always wanted. The West Loop network. My distribution contacts. The political access I've spent 15 years building. He wasn't looking at her. He was scanning the room with that continuous tracking attention. What he's decided is that the cleanest way to get it is to make me negotiate from a position of loss. The words sat between them. What kind of loss? She asked, though she already knew. He looked at her then. Direct. No armor, no assessment, just the unguarded thing that had been arriving slowly and had now fully arrived, clear and unequivocal in his face, and she felt it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. Not with one sense, but with the whole body. The kind, he said, that I've spent 15 years making sure I didn't have. The room exploded. Not metaphorically, physically, actually, with a sound like the world had changed its mind about its own architecture. The crack of gunfire, somewhere to the left and near, and the subsequent shatter of a window and the immediate human response that was half panic and half instinct. Chairs scraping back, bodies dropping, screams building from the near side of the room and spreading outward. Elena felt Luca's hand close on her arm. Not hard, not panicked, but with the precise directional force of a man who knew exactly which way to move, and then they were moving, not toward the exit with the crowd, but sideways, toward the wall, toward the service corridor he'd clearly already mapped, because of course he had, because that was how he walked into every room. Behind them the shooting continued, not aimed at them, she realized, aimed elsewhere, a distraction, a statement. And Marco was suddenly there, materializing from the panicking crowd with the calm of a man who had been waiting for exactly this, and the three of them were through the service door and in the corridor, and moving. And in Elena's chest, something had torn loose that she couldn't put back. Not fear, not the panic response her nervous system had been trained to produce in crowds. Something older than that, simpler. The understanding, arriving without negotiation, that she was no longer a variable in someone else's calculation. She was the reason the calculation existed at all. And behind them, in the ruined ballroom, Vincent Caro was still somewhere in the crowd, unhurried, already planning the next. The service corridor was 40 feet long and smelled like industrial cleaning solution and old grease, and Elena counted every step. 1, 2, 3. Marco was ahead of them, moving with the particular economy of a man for whom a crisis was simply a different category of Tuesday, checking each door with the back of his hand before pushing through. Luca had Elena's wrist, not her hand, her wrist, the specific grip of someone who understood the difference between guiding and controlling. And he was watching the corridor behind them with the continuous tracking attention she'd learned to read as his operational mode, the mode where everything else went offline and only threat geometry remained. The gunfire had stopped. That was worse than if it had continued, because the stopping meant a transition. From statement to consequence, from warning to something with a different kind of intention. "Where are we going?" Elena asked. "There's a loading dock at the end of this corridor. Car's already—" "Marco." Luca's voice changed. Single syllable, specific weight. Marco had stopped at the door at the end of the corridor. He wasn't opening it. He was standing with his hand flat against the surface, head slightly angled, listening. The three of them held still. Footsteps. The other side of the door. 2 people, maybe 3, moving without the panicked randomness of gala guests who'd lost their way. Moving with direction. Luca's hand on Elena's wrist pulled her back 2 steps, smooth and immediate, putting himself between her and the door without making a production of it, without drama, the way a person moves when they've already run the scenario and know where to be. Marco looked back. A look that communicated something Elena couldn't fully decode. A question or an answer to a question. Something that moved between them in the compressed language of 2 men who'd been in corridors like this before. Then Marco pushed through a side door Elena hadn't clocked. A linen closet, narrow, shelves of tablecloths and napkins stacked to the ceiling, and the 3 of them were inside with the door pulled shut in under 4 seconds. The footsteps passed outside. Elena's back was against a shelf. Luca was directly in front of her in the dark, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could hear his breathing, controlled, slower than the situation seemed to warrant, the breathing of someone who had disciplined their body into cooperation with their mind over a very long time. She focused on the sound of it, let it set a pace for her own. The footsteps faded. Marco cracked the door, looked, held up 2 fingers, then made a gesture Elena didn't know the language of, but Luca did, because he moved immediately. Out of the closet, back down the corridor, away from the loading dock now, toward a stairwell she hadn't noticed on the way through. "Change of plan," Marco said quietly. "There's a secondary exit," Luca said. Not to Marco, but slightly toward Elena, which she understood as the courtesy of a man who'd remembered she couldn't navigate a building she'd never been in. 2 flights up, east side. "Okay," she said. They moved. The car was waiting on the east side of the building, which meant Marco had already communicated the change by the time they hit the street, which meant there were more people involved in this than the 3 of them, more infrastructure, more moving parts that had all begun moving the moment the first shot was fired. Elena absorbed this while getting into the car and found it less alarming than she probably should have. Luca got in beside her. Marco sat up front. The car moved. No one spoke for 90 seconds. Then Luca said, "Are you hurt?" "No," Elena said. "Your hands." She looked down at them. They were shaking. She hadn't noticed. "Adrenaline," she said. "Not fear. There's a difference." He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something fractured, something that had too many components to read cleanly. Not the exhausted assessment, not the almost smile, not the raw openness from the storage room. Something past all of those. Something that had been forced to the surface by the specific pressure of the last 20 minutes. "I'm taking you home," he said. "All right. Marco will have people on your building tonight and Luca." She turned to face him in the dark car, the city lights sliding past the windows. "Tell me what happened in there. The real version, not the version where you give me the minimum and manage the rest." He looked out the window. "That was a message," he said. "The shooting was directed at the ceiling, designed to create panic, not casualties." He paused. "It's Caro saying he controls the environment, that he can turn any room into chaos whenever he decides to. And the meeting with you? What was that about?" "The same thing it's always about." The city lights moved across his face. "He wants me to fold the West Loop network into his operation, step back from the political relationships I maintain, effectively disappear." A pause. "In exchange, he leaves what I care about intact." The words "what I care about" landed in the specific way that words land when they're not abstractions. "He means me," Elena said. "He means several things. Yes." She looked at her hands, which had mostly stopped shaking. "And you're not going to fold?" "No." "Because if you fold, it doesn't actually stop." He looked at her. "No, it doesn't." She'd known that. She'd known it from the voice on the phone, that particular temperature of calculation that didn't have a stopping point built into it, because men who operated like Caro didn't stop. They just renegotiated what the next ask was going to be. Margaret could have told her that. She'd worked it out herself in the car. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated as if he wasn't sure what she meant by it. "I mean, okay, I understand. Not okay as in this is fine." She looked out her own window. "None of this is fine." "No. But panicking doesn't make it less fine." She took a careful breath. "So, what's next?" He was quiet for a long moment. She felt him deciding, the precise internal calibration of what to say, how much, how honest. She'd learned to wait for it rather than push into it, because pushing collapsed the process and got her less. "I need to find out how Caro knew about tonight," he said finally, "how he had people in position that fast. That requires information I don't have yet." "You think someone told him?" "I think someone told him." "Someone inside." The word inside carried the weight he'd put on it. The specific weight of betrayal, of the interior having been breached, of the perimeter having a gap that had been cut deliberately rather than worn by weather. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Place. Her apartment. 3rd floor, North Paulina, above the dry cleaner that breathed solvent smell up through the floorboards in a way she'd stopped noticing years ago. Elena stood in her kitchen in the green dress and her coat and looked at the room with the eyes of someone seeing it from the outside. The stacked books on every surface, the single armchair by the window that was her reading chair, the kitchen table that was also a desk, that was also a surface for whatever she was currently in the middle of, the particular organized disorder of a woman who lived alone and had never had a reason to make the space presentable for anyone else. She heard a car outside, and then another. Marco's people taking up their positions. She changed out of the dress. She made tea she didn't drink. She sat in the armchair and opened a book she didn't read. At 1:17 a.m., her phone rang. "Luca." "You're awake," he said. "Were you expecting otherwise?" "No." A pause, something in the background. Voices, low, not the street. He was somewhere operational. "I'm sorry about tonight." "Don't." "Elena." "I said don't." She kept her voice even. "You didn't plan for someone to fire a gun at a ceiling. Don't apologize for something you didn't do." A brief silence. "I put you in the room." "I walked into the room." "I knew what the room was when I walked into it." She pulled the blanket off the back of the armchair onto her legs. "Did you find out about the leak?" A longer pause. Working on it, he said, which meant no. Which meant the thing was open and bleeding and he was staring at it. Get some sleep, she said. You too. She didn't sleep until 4 GTS. The name came through at 7 in the morning. She didn't know it was a name when Luca arrived at her door at 7:12 with Marco behind him, and the look on his face that she'd never seen before. Not the operational mode, not the controlled stillness, but something that had gotten past all of those. Something that had been hit hard enough that the architecture was showing the damage. She let them in. She had coffee made. She handed Luca a cup without asking, and he took it without acknowledging it, which meant he was deep enough in whatever had happened that social processing was offline. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table. Tell me, she said. He set the coffee cup down. He looked at his hands. Danny Ricci, he said. She didn't know the name. Who's that? He's been with me for 9 years. His voice was flat in the specific way that flat voices are when they're doing an enormous amount of structural work to contain what's underneath. He came up in Bridgeport. I knew his father. I gave Danny his first real position when he was 23 years old, and nobody else in the city would look at him because his father had made choices that left the family's name marked. A pause. I looked at him anyway. Elena was very still. He's been feeding information to Caro for 8 months, Luca said. Distribution routes, meeting schedules, contact names. His jaw moved. The political relationships I've spent 15 years building. He gave Caro a list. The quality of the silence in the kitchen was different from the silences in the bookstore. Those silences were habitual, comfortable, the silences of a space designed for quiet. This one was load-bearing. How did you find out? She asked. Marco found a discrepancy in a payment trace, small enough that it should have been invisible. He glanced at Marco, who was standing by the kitchen door with his arms at his sides and his face at maximum neutrality. Danny made one mistake. He used an account that had a dormant connection to a numbered account Caro set up for a property deal in 2019. Thin thread. Marco pulled it. Where's Danny now? Downstairs. His eyes came to her face. In the car. The implication of that settled in the room. Elena looked at the coffee cup in her own hands. She looked at the man across the table from her. The severity of the face, the broken architecture visible now in the way he was sitting, the way the controlled stillness had become something heavier, something that wasn't control but was carrying itself like control because there was no other available mode. What are you going to do? She asked. He didn't answer. She didn't ask again. She understood that there were rooms in his life she couldn't go into, not because they were locked against her specifically, but because the rooms existed in a moral landscape that her own moral landscape didn't include, and that the navigation of them was his alone, and that whatever he did or didn't do in those rooms was a thing she had chosen to be adjacent to when she'd taken his arm at the top of the steps the night before, and she couldn't unknow that now. He knew about me, Luca said. The words arrived with difficulty, like something being pulled up from depth. Danny. He knew the store. He knew the pattern. His eyes were on the table. He gave Caro your address. The coffee cup in her hands was very precise in her awareness, the weight of it, the warmth. That's how they found my building, she said. Before last night, before I put security on it. He looked up. The look in his face was the look of a man who has run a calculation and found that the variable he cared most about was the one he'd failed to protect first. I didn't know. I should have moved faster. I should have... Stop. She set the cup down. Look at me. He did. You didn't know, she said. A man you trusted for 9 years. A man you chose to believe in when no one else would. He chose to betray that. The choice was his, not yours. She held his eyes. You don't get to carry his choice. He looked at her with the fractured openness fully exposed now. No armor, no recession, just the rawness of it, the thing that the breach had uncovered. And she thought that nobody had said that to him before. Not because no one had wanted to, but because no one had been positioned to. Because the people in his life had always existed at a slight remove that made the really direct sentences impossible. She was not at a remove. She'd stopped being at a remove sometime around a Wednesday morning in early November when he'd held the jammed receipt paper and she'd almost smiled at him and he'd almost smiled back. Marco, Luca said without looking away from her. Sir, give us a minute. Marco was gone from the kitchen with the characteristic discretion of a man who had been giving people minutes for 11 years. In the silence that followed, Luca reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not holding, just present. The weight of it. She turned her hand over. They sat like that for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. In the kitchen above the dry cleaner on North Paulina, with the city beginning its day outside the window and the residue of the night before in every corner of the room. I need to deal with this, he said. I know. I'll be here, she said. He looked at their hands on the table. You should go to the store. I was planning to. Marco will. I know, she said. I know about Marco. I'm fine with Marco. She squeezed his hand once and released it, the way you release something when you're choosing to release it rather than having it taken. Go. He stood. He put his jacket back on with the movements of a man resettling his armor, and she watched the process. The controlled stillness reassembling itself, the severity of the face reestablishing, the Luca Moretti that Chicago knew and feared sliding back over the Luca Moretti that sat in her armchair and read James Baldwin. And she thought, both of those are real. That's the thing people don't understand. Neither one is the mask. He paused at the kitchen door. The Highsmith, he said. The one about the people on the train. You said the protagonist makes choices that don't make logical sense because he wants something he's decided he can't want. She looked at him. Yes. I understand that now, he said. I didn't when you recommended it. He left. She sat at the table for 5 minutes. Then she got up, got dressed, and went to work. The marginalia was cold in the mornings now. December had arrived without announcement, dropping the temperature of the building's old bones into the range where the heating system fought a losing battle until mid-morning. Elena turned the heat up 2 degrees, which Margaret would mention when she arrived, and began opening the register. Normal. Manageable. The specific silence of the store. At 10:15, the bell above the door rang, and the man who came in was not Marco, and was not a regular customer, and was not anyone she'd seen before, but she knew immediately. The way her overtuned nervous system always knew, the way she'd known about the sedan before she'd articulated why, that something was wrong. He was young, late 20s, light jacket for the temperature, the deliberate ordinariness of someone who'd dressed to not be remembered. He came to the counter without looking at the shelves, which no one did in a bookstore unless the shelves weren't why they were there. Elena Hartwell, he said. Not a question. Can I help you? She said. Her voice was level, her hands were at her sides. He put a phone on the counter, screen up, facing her. A photograph? A car. Her car. The older Honda she kept in the lot on Ogden, with what appeared to be a device attached to the underside of the rear bumper, the image taken close, from ground level, clearly deliberate. That was attached this morning, the man said, before you drove to work. Elena looked at the photograph. She looked at the man. Who sent you, she said. Someone who wants you to understand the situation. He slid the phone closer to her. Mr. Caro would like a conversation. Just you. Without Mr. Moretti's involvement. He paused. He says to tell you that this is the conversation that determines how the next part of this goes. For the store. For the woman who owns it. For you. Margaret. The name landed in Elena's chest like something with mass. He already has people in a car on West Hubbard, the man said, pleasantly, neutrally, with the same temperature as the voice on the phone the night before. Just to clarify the options. Elena's hand was on the counter, completely still. She was counting without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. But the numbers weren't working the way they usually worked, weren't producing the manageable distance she usually got from them, because the thing she was managing wasn't anxiety this time. It was the understanding, arriving clean and total, the way real understanding always arrives, without steps, without transition, that she was the pressure point, that she had been the pressure point since the gala, since the staircase, since the first morning Luca had walked through the door and sat in the armchair, and she had handed him 3 Hammett novels and a key she hadn't known she was giving, that every step she'd taken toward him had been a step that Caro had watched and measured and built a structure around, and that the structure had just closed. Tell me where, she said. The man across the counter blinked. A micro-expression, a half-second disruption in the pleasant neutrality. The faintest evidence that he'd expected more resistance had been briefed to expect more resistance. She didn't give him time to recover. "Tell me where," she said again. "And when? And I'll come." She looked at the phone on the counter. "But I need to know Margaret is left alone. I need to hear that from Caro directly." The man looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the phone, made a call, spoke 2 sentences, listened, and held the phone out. The voice on the other end was the voice from the night before. Unhurried, empty. "Miss Hartwell," Caro said, "I appreciate your practicality." "The woman who owns this store," Elena said. "She's not part of this. She never was. Your word on that." A pause. "You have it." "Then tell me where." She wrote the address on the back of a receipt. She looked at the paper in her hand for a long moment after the man had left, the bell above the door ringing with its usual mundane cheerfulness, as if the world were the same world it had been 5 minutes ago. Then she pulled out her phone. She didn't call Luca. She set the phone face down on the counter and looked at the address, and she understood that if she called him, he would come. And if he came, it would be exactly what Caro wanted. Luca Moretti walking into a room Caro had set up and controlled, reactive and off balance, led there by the one variable that could override every calculation he'd spent 15 years. She left the store at 11:40. She told Margaret she had a personal errand, which was the most useless lie she'd ever told, because Margaret looked at her face and looked at the door and looked back at her face and said nothing, which was the specific kind of nothing that meant everything and was also the kindest thing Margaret had ever done for her. Elena walked to her car on Ogden. She stood next to it for 30 seconds, looking at the rear bumper without crouching down to confirm what the photograph had already confirmed, because confirming it would make it a different kind of real, and she needed it to stay in the current category of real for a little longer. She got in. She drove. The address was on the southeast side, a neighborhood where the buildings had the exhausted look of places that had been used for things, and then abandoned to the evidence of being used. Old industrial blocks, most of them repurposed or in the process of not being repurposed. The streets too wide for the current traffic and the sidewalks empty in the way that sidewalks are empty when the people who used to fill them had somewhere else to be and the somewhere else had turned out to be permanent. She parked on the street because there was nowhere else to park. She sat in the car for 60 seconds. She counted. The building the address pointed to was a converted warehouse. Brick, 3 stories, the ground floor windows covered with metal sheeting that had been there long enough to develop its own rust pattern. A door on the south side with a light above it, the only light. 2 men outside the door with the positioning of people who were there on purpose. She got out of the car. The wind off the lake hit her immediately, the particular December wind that didn't negotiate. She walked toward the door with her hands in her coat pockets, and her heart doing something too fast and too loud behind her ribs, and her count running at the back of her mind like a low-grade frequency. 23, 24, 25. Not because it was helping, but because her nervous system had been running it since the man had put the phone on her counter, and she didn't know how to stop it now. One of the men at the door stepped forward. He looked at her without expression and said, "Phone." She gave it to him. He stepped back. The other man opened the door. She went in. The interior had been organized for the meeting, the way a room gets organized when the person doing the organizing wants you to understand the power dynamic before anyone says a word. High ceilings, exposed beams, the far reaches of the space, dark enough that you couldn't see the walls clearly. A table in the center, not a boardroom table, a folding table, deliberately functional, the choice of someone who wanted to signal that this was not a conversation between equals, but a transaction, a reading of terms. 2 chairs on one side, one on the other. Caro was already sitting. His hands were on the table, relaxed, the expensive ease fully operational. There was a man standing behind him to the left that Elena hadn't expected, bigger than the men at the door, the kind of physical scale that existed to be seen, to do arithmetic in the observer's nervous system. There was also a man she recognized. Danny Ricci was sitting in the second chair on Caro's side of the table, and he looked like a man who had made a decision and was now living inside the weight of it, and had discovered that the weight was different than he'd calculated. He was younger than she'd expected, late 20s, early 30s, with a face that might have been open once and had closed down around something specific, the specific closure of a person who had convinced themselves that the thing they were doing was necessary and was finding, too late, that necessity didn't actually make things lighter. He looked at Elena when she came in. She held his eyes for 2 seconds, no longer. She sat down. "Thank you for coming," Caro said. "You made the options clear," Elena said. "I tried to." He looked at her with the pleasant assessment she'd seen at the gala. The same measurement, but without the performance of warmth that a social setting required. Here, it was cleaner, just the arithmetic. "You're more composed than I expected. You expected me to be afraid." "Most people are, in a room like this." "I'm anxious," she said. "It's different." Something moved at the corner of Caro's mouth. Not quite a smile. The acknowledgement of a point. "Luca didn't tell me you were like this. Luca doesn't tell you things." "He told Danny." Caro glanced at the man beside him. "Danny told me." Elena looked at Danny again. His jaw was tight. He was looking at the table now, at his own hands, which were doing the thing her hands did when she was managing something. Held very still, deliberately, the stillness that cost more than movement. "The store," Elena said. "Margaret Chen. You said she was out of it." "She is." "Then say what you need to say." Caro leaned forward slightly. The pleasantness didn't go anywhere. It was structural, built in, a permanent feature. "What I need is simple. I need Luca Moretti to step back from the West Loop network and transfer the Delano and Park contacts to my operation. I need him to cease the political relationships with Alderman Brooks and Commissioner Hale, and I need him to do it within 72 hours. He paused. "In exchange, this ends. Everything you're worried about ends. The store is safe. You're safe. And Luca continues his life, diminished but alive." Diminished but alive. The phrase had been prepared. It had a shape to it that meant it had been said before, maybe in the mirror, maybe to the men behind him. "And if he doesn't," Elena said, "then we escalate. Simple. Clean." "I have patience, Ms. Hartwell. I've been building toward this conversation for 2 years. I can continue building for 2 more. The pleasant eyes settled on her face. "But you can't live in what 2 more years of this looks like, and neither can the people around you." Elena looked at the table. She looked at her own hands, which were still. She noticed that. She had stopped counting somewhere between the parking lot and the door, and her hands had gone still on their own. "You want me to deliver the message," she said. "I want you to help him understand the reality of his position." Caro's voice was patient, almost gentle. "You're the only person he listens to. You know that. I know that." "Danny, don't," Danny said. Everyone at the table looked at him. He was still looking at his hands. "Don't use her name like that." His voice was low, rough at the edges. The voice of a man who had been quiet for too long and had lost some of the smoothness from it. Caro looked at Danny with an expression that was the first genuinely cold thing Elena had seen from him. A flatness behind the pleasant exterior, a room behind the room. "Danny," Caro said, "I told you what you needed. I gave you the routes and the schedules and the—" Danny stopped. His hands had tightened on the table. "I didn't tell you to touch the store. I didn't tell you to put the woman in a building. You told me what he cared about. That's not the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing." Caro's voice hadn't changed in pitch or speed. That was what made it colder. "You gave me the leverage. What I do with leverage is my business." The muscle in Danny's jaw was working. He was not, Elena could see, a man who had fully understood what he was getting into when he'd started 8 months ago, and he was understanding it now in increments, in the specific awful increments of comprehension that arrived as the situation revealed its actual shape. She looked at him. He felt the look and met it. "You knew him," she said, not accusing, just placing it. Danny's throat moved. "Since I was 17. And you still. I had reasons. I had—" The sentence broke. He looked back at the table. "They don't matter now?" "They don't," Caro agreed pleasantly. Elena turned back to Caro. "I'll deliver the message." "Good. But not the way you're framing it." She kept her voice level. "I won't tell him he's beaten. I won't tell him his position is what you're saying it is. I'll tell him the terms, and I'll tell him that the conversation happened. What he does with that is his. Caro studied her for a moment, the pleasant assessment running its arithmetic. That's acceptable, he said, as long as the message is delivered. I need my phone back. After we're done. We're done, Elena said. She was outside with her phone in her hand and the December wind in her face, and her legs doing something slightly unreliable when the text came through. Not from Luca. From an unknown number. But the message had the cadence and the syntax of someone who'd sent messages in exactly this style before. He knows you went in. He's been outside the building for 40 minutes. She looked up from the phone. Down the block, a black car. Not the one she recognized from the past weeks. A different one, older, less obvious, was parked against the curb with the engine running and the vapor from the exhaust making small, consistent clouds in the cold. She walked toward it. The window came down before she got there. Marco was in the passenger seat. The driver was someone she didn't know. And in the back seat, Luca Moretti was sitting with the look on his face that she'd only seen once before, in the kitchen this morning. The look that was past all the architecture, past the controlled stillness, past every calibrated public surface he'd ever built. Raw. Purely and completely raw. She got in. The door closed. The car didn't move. You went in, he said. Yes. Alone. Yes. The words sat in the car with a weight that displaced air. If he had... His voice was different. Not stripped flat the way it had been in the kitchen, but compressed, the way a voice gets when what it's compressing is something too large for the container. He didn't, she said. Elena, he didn't. She turned to face him in the back seat. I needed to hear what he was offering directly, without you in the room. Because if you were in the room, it wasn't a conversation, it was a confrontation, and I needed the conversation. She held his eyes. I also needed him to see that I came alone, that I wasn't managed into it, that I made the choice. Why does that matter? Because men like Caro respect calculation more than fear. If I'd come because you put me in a car and drove me there, I was a prop. I came on my own. I'm a factor. She watched his face. I made myself a factor. The quiet in the car lasted for several seconds. What were his terms? Luca said. She told him. All of it. The West Loop network, the political contacts, the 72 hours, the diminished but alive. She said it plainly, the way she read inventory, without inflection or editorializing, because the terms were the terms and he needed to hear them without her processing them first. He listened. He didn't interrupt. His face did nothing visible during the recitation, which meant he was doing everything internal, running the full calculation behind the sealed surface. When she finished, he said, Danny was there. Yes. What did he do? He told Caro not to use me the way Caro was using me. She paused. I don't know what that cost him. Luca looked out the window, at the building she'd just come out of, brick and metal sheeting and the door with the light above it. She watched him look at it and understand it. The room inside it, the conversation inside it, what Elena had walked into alone. I'm not taking his terms, Luca said. I know. The West Loop doesn't fold. The political relationships don't fold. Nothing folds. His jaw. That's not how this ends. Then how does it end? He looked at her. I need 48 hours. There are people in the city who have been waiting for Caro to overreach. He's been careful. He's been careful for years. But he put men in a hotel with firearms last night, and he put you in a building today, and those are the kinds of moves that leave evidence, that make other people nervous, that give me something to work with. His voice had the precision of someone who'd been building the sentence for the last 40 minutes. I need 48 hours to make the calls that need to be made. And in 48 hours? In 48 hours, Caro doesn't have the leverage he thinks he has. She looked at him steadily. You're going to take him apart. I'm going to remove him. Simple, clean, the same temperature as Caro's worst moments. And she understood, sitting in the back of the car in the cold, that this was part of who he was. Not a performance, not a mask, but the actual capacity. The thing that had built an empire and maintained it for 15 years. The thing that had made Chicago say his name the way they said weather. Okay, she said. I need you somewhere. I'm going back to the store, she said. Elena. Margaret doesn't know what's happening. I left her without an explanation. I'm going back. She met the objection in his eyes before he could form it. Marco can station everyone he wants outside, but I'm going back. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. Then he said, Marco. Sir, full coverage on the store in Ms. Hartwell's building. I want 4 people minimum on each location. He didn't look away from Elena while he said it. And I want to know if anyone so much as parks on West Hubbard without a reason. Understood. She put her hand on the door. Luca? She said his name the way she always said it, without ceremony, without distance. Come to the store when it's done, whenever that is, whatever time. She paused. I'll leave the back door unlocked. She got out. She walked to her car. She drove back to West Hubbard, and the city moved past her windows in its ordinary Thursday afternoon way. And she drove with her hands at 10 and 2 and her count running steadily in the back of her mind. Not because she was managing fear, but because it was the rhythm her brain had learned for situations larger than it knew how to contain. And this was, definitively, one of those. But the 48 hours were not 48 hours. They were 31. She knew this because she was at the store when it began to resolve. Not with a phone call, not with Marco appearing at the door with an update, but with the particular quality of silence that falls over a city block when vehicles that have been present stop being present. The cars she'd cataloged parked along West Hubbard, 3 different ones in rotation. She'd been tracking them the way she tracked everything, quietly, with the peripheral precision her nervous system had always run, were gone by Thursday evening and did not come back. Margaret noticed. Margaret said nothing. Friday morning, Danny Ricci called her store. She'd given him nothing. No number, no contact, nothing. But he found it, which meant he'd known it, which meant he'd known the store in the particular detailed way of someone who'd been feeding information about it to someone else. And she answered the phone and heard his voice and felt the complicated weight of it. I need you to tell him something, Danny said. He sounded like a man who'd been awake for 30 hours, voice roughed down to its grain. Tell him it was the kids, in Joliet. A pause that had mass. Caro threatened the placement, said he could have the county review reopened, have them separated. I know that's not... His voice broke slightly at the joint and reassembled. I know that doesn't make it right. Elena held the phone. I'll tell him, she said. I know what's coming, Danny said. I'm not asking him to stop it. I just wanted another break, longer. He was the only person who looked at me when nobody else would. I just wanted him to know why. She held the phone for a moment after the call ended. She looked at the receipt taped to the wall beside the register. A habit she had, taping things she wanted to remember where she could see them. The one Luca had written his number on, his handwriting small and precise. Not a performance of casualness or formality, just direct. She picked up her phone and typed, Danny called. He said to tell you it was the children in Joliet. He said he knows what's coming, and he's not asking you to stop it. He just wanted you to know why. She sent it. The response came after a pause long enough to mean the information had arrived and been processed and cost something. I know. 2 words. She looked at them for a long time. Luca came to the back door at 11:47 Friday night. She heard the specific knock, 3 short, and she was already in the back of the store, already had the kettle on, already had the armchair she'd moved from the front of the store to the small office area because it was warmer back here, and she'd known, with the certainty of someone whose nervous system was permanently calibrated to the texture of situations, that tonight was the night. She opened the door. He came in out of the cold and he looked, not diminished, nothing like diminished, but different in the way a structure looks different after it's been tested, after the load-bearing elements have demonstrated they could carry the weight, and you can see where the test showed in the material. There was a cut above his left eyebrow, fresh enough to still be dark. His jacket was wrong, not damaged, but worn differently, the evidence of a night in it that had not been sedentary. His hands, when he put them around the mug she handed him, were steady in the way that things are steady after shaking. She looked at the cut. It looks worse than... I know, she said. Sit down. He sat in the armchair. She got the first aid kit from the shelf where it lived. She'd moved it to the back of the store 2 days ago. The same night she'd moved the armchair, the same efficiency of a woman preparing for something without fully acknowledging she was preparing. And she cleaned the cut above his eyebrow with the same care she'd used on his hand in the storage room. He didn't wince. She hadn't expected him to. "Caro," she said, "is no longer a concern." She didn't ask what that meant in practical terms. Some rooms she didn't go into. She'd accepted that. "The network?" "Intact." His voice was low, tired in the bone-deep way rather than the surface way. "The political contacts are... It'll take time to reassure some of them, but they'll stay." He paused. Brooks was actually relieved. Turns out Caro had been applying his own kind of pressure for 6 months. Having Caro removed resolves more than one problem. And Danny, the silence lasted 4 seconds. 5. "Danny is handled," he said. She pressed the last edge of the adhesive strip flat against his skin and didn't ask what handled meant, because she could read the weight of the word, and the weight was complex and had grief in it beneath the granite. And men like Luca Moretti processed grief in their own architecture and on their own schedule, and she wasn't going to excavate it tonight. She was still standing close from cleaning the cut, close enough that when he looked up from the mug in his hands, his eyes found hers immediately, nothing in between. "I put you in this," he said. "I walked into this." "Elena, I walked into the gala," she said. "I fell down the stairs. I opened the store the next morning and I recommended you ham it and I answered your questions and I went to the hotel dinner." She met his eyes. "Every one of those things was mine. You don't get to retroactively own my choices." He looked at her. The rawness was back. Not fractured this time. Not leaking through a breach, but present, fully present. The way something is present when it stopped fighting to stay hidden. "I should have kept more distance," he said. "In the beginning, when I understood what was... Why didn't you?" The question landed in the room. He looked at the mug in his hands. He looked at the first aid kit she'd set on the desk. He looked at the shelves of backup inventory around them, the small, organized world of the back of the marginalia, and then he looked at her. "Because you handed me receipt paper," he said. She blinked. "The jammed printer, you turned around and held out the paper without looking, like I was anyone." His jaw moved. "Like I was just someone who happened to be there." The exhausted eyes. "I couldn't remember the last time someone treated me like I was just someone who happened to be there." The kettle on the small hot plate was beginning its pre-boil murmur. The heating system ticked. Outside, the city moved through its Friday night with the indifferent vitality it maintained regardless of what happened inside buildings. She sat down on the edge of the desk, close. "I knew what you were from the third visit," she said. "I looked you up." "I know." "And I know." She looked at him. The severe face, the old scar at the corner of his mouth, the architecture that had been built for a kind of life she'd never lived and couldn't fully imagine. And underneath it, underneath all of it, the man who funded children's homes and didn't talk about it, who read Hammett and Baldwin in an armchair and asked questions about what it meant to want to be good in a world that made it expensive, who had stood outside her building in a parked car for 40 minutes because he couldn't make himself leave. She reached out and put her hand against the side of his face. Carefully. The way you put your hand against something you've been careful with for a long time and have finally decided to stop being only careful with. He went completely still. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "I've said it before. I'll keep saying it until you actually believe it." He turned his face very slightly into her hand. The smallest movement. The most costly. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Whatever this is." "Neither do I," she said. "I'm the woman who eats lunch alone and counts to calm herself down and couldn't get through the gala without nearly falling down a staircase." She paused. "But here we are." He looked up at her, and she saw it. The thing that had been arriving since November, since marble staircases and receipt paper and early morning armchairs, fully arrived now. No armor, no recession, nothing between the expression and its source. She leaned forward and kissed him. Careful and direct and without performance. The way she did most things. The way she handed people books. The way she answered questions. The way she'd walked into Caro's building and sat down across from him without letting her hands shake. He kissed her back with the particular care of a man handling something he was terrified of breaking. Outside, the winter city moved through its Friday night. Inside the Marginalia's back room, something had completed itself that had been in the process of completing for weeks, for every morning and every armchair and every almost smile, and the world had shifted its weight to accommodate it. But she didn't know, at that moment, that 30 blocks south, 3 men were delivering a message to the last 2 members of Caro's operation who hadn't yet understood that the operation was over. She didn't know that one of those men was Marco, who would call Luca in 40 minutes with a single sentence. She didn't know that the sentence would require them both to move immediately back into the city's machinery, that the resolution she thought had arrived was in fact only Marco's call came at 12:23 a.m. Luca's phone was on the desk beside the first aid kit, and the ringtone in the small back room of the Marginalia was too loud for the hour, too loud for the specific texture of what had just shifted between them, and Elena felt the sound of it the way you feel a hand on your shoulder when you've been somewhere quiet. Not frightening, but decisive. The world asserting its claim. Luca reached for the phone without moving away from her, which she registered. He listened for 11 seconds. His face did the thing, the controlled stillness assembling itself, the operational mode coming back online, the architecture rebuilding in real time. She watched it and felt no resentment toward it, because she understood now that the architecture wasn't a wall between them. It was the thing that had kept him alive long enough for there to be a them, and she wasn't going to be the person who resented his survival mechanisms. "Where?" he said. A pause. "Don't move until I get there." He ended the call. He looked at her. "There are 2 men," he said. "Caro's operation, what's left of it. They've been at a property on South Halsted for the past 3 hours." He paused. "They have Danny." The name landed in the room with the specific weight of something unfinished. Elena looked at the first aid kit. She looked at the mug on the armrest of the chair. She looked at Luca's face with the fresh cut above the eyebrow and the exhaustion that had been running underneath everything for as long as she'd known him. "Danny called the store this morning," she said. "He knew what was coming. He said he wasn't asking you to stop it." "I know what he said." "Do you know what he meant by it?" Luca was still. The operational mode, fully online now, but underneath it, she'd learned to read underneath it, something that was not as resolved as the stillness suggested. "He meant he accepted it," Luca said. "He meant he was tired," Elena said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for 3 seconds. 4. The calculation running. Not threat assessment this time, something more interior, something that had to do with a 17-year-old from Bridgeport who'd grown up in the shadow of a ruined name and been given a hand when no one else would offer one, and what it cost to hold that history against what came after. "I have to go," he said. "I know." He picked up his jacket from the chair. At the door, he stopped. "Elena, go," she said. "But don't go having already decided the outcome." He looked at her. "Whatever you decide," she said, "decide it there. Not here. Not on the way." She held his eyes. "Give him the room to be more than what he did." A long moment. The heating system ticking, the city outside. Then he was gone, and the cold came briefly through the open door and then sealed itself off. And Elena stood in the back room of the store and looked at the armchair and the 2 mugs and the first aid kit and the quiet. She sat down. She picked up the nearest book. It was the James Baldwin, his copy, left here over the past weeks the way he'd started leaving things. A jacket once, a specific newspaper folded to an article, small evidence of a life starting to overlap with another one. She didn't open it. She held it in her lap, and she waited. South Halsted at nearly 1 in the morning had the specific character of a street that knew it was being used for something it wasn't supposed to be used for and had developed the tact not to comment. The property was a walk up above a closed auto parts store, the kind of building that had outlasted 3 different purposes and was on its way to outlasting a 4th. Marco met Luca on the street with 2 men he trusted, and the particular brevity of someone who understood that everything necessary had already been communicated in the phone call. 2 of them, Marco said. Pellegrino and a man I don't have a name for yet. They picked Danny up outside his apartment at 9. A pause. They're not Caro people by choice. They're Caro people because Caro had something on both of them, and with Caro gone, they're... He chose the word carefully. Improvising. Improvising how? They think Danny is the asset, that whoever holds Danny holds the leverage. Marco looked at the building. They don't know the landscape has changed. Does Danny know? Unknown. Luca looked at the building. 3 stories, 1 stairwell, external. 2 windows lit on the second floor, neither curtained, which meant either they weren't worried about being seen or they hadn't thought about it. And men who hadn't thought about it were more dangerous in some configurations than men who had, because unpredictability had its own mathematics. I go up alone, Luca said. Luca, you're on the street. If it goes wrong, you know what to do. He looked at Marco. It won't go wrong. Marco's face. The neutrality, and underneath it. She would never see this, Elena. She didn't have the context for it. Something that was the compressed version of 11 years of loyalty, of a man who had watched another man make himself into something impossible, and had stood near it close enough to be marked by it without being consumed. Don't be stupid, Marco said. I'll try, Luca said, which was the closest he came to a joke in a situation like this, and Marco understood it as such, and said nothing more. Chet. The stairwell smelled like old carpet, and something chemical, and the specific human residue of a building that had been home to too many people with too little space. Luca went up with the careful placement of a man who'd learned which stairs announced themselves and which ones didn't. Weight at the outside edge, 3 points of contact. The particular patience of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that speed and silence were enemies, and silence was the better ally. Second floor. The lit door was the second one. He could hear voices, 2 of them, one higher, one lower, the lower one doing most of the talking. He knocked. The voices stopped. Housekeeping, he said, which was not a real thing to say, but what it did was create a half-second of genuine confusion, of the mind trying to process the absurdity and coming up with nothing, and in that half-second, he opened the door. The room was small and badly lit and smelled like cigarettes and fast food containers, and the particular human sour of men who had been tense for hours. Pellegrino was on his feet immediately, hand going to his jacket, and the man without a name was standing near the window with the posture of someone who hadn't decided yet what they were willing to do. Danny was in a chair near the far wall. His hands weren't bound. They'd been smarter than that, or lazier. It amounted to the same result. But the chair was positioned with his back to the wall and Pellegrino between him and the door, which was its own kind of restraint. He had a cut at the corner of his mouth, and the careful stillness of a man who had assessed the room and decided that stillness was the only card he had left. He looked at Luca, and Luca looked at him. 9 years of it compressed into a look. The Bridgeport street corner, the handshake, the specific quality of that first year when Danny had worked with the hunger of someone who understood he'd been given something rare and was trying to justify the gift. Every room they'd been in together, every decision, every gradual slow drift toward a place where the man Luca had believed in and the man sitting in the chair were the same person and also weren't. Pellegrino said, "How did you—" "Put it down," Luca said. "You don't—" Pellegrino. Flat, patient, the voice that didn't need volume. "I know about the storage unit on Western. I know about the arrangement with the Garfield Park people. I know about your daughter's school and the tuition situation." A pause. "I'm not here about any of that. Put it down and go home." The room held its breath. Pellegrino's hand was still at his jacket. His eyes were running the calculation, the specific arithmetic of a man weighing what he had against what the man in the doorway had, and arriving slowly at the answer that the math had been pointing to the whole time. He took his hand away from his jacket. "Go home," Luca said again. "Both of you." The man without a name was already at the window, looking for the alternative exit that didn't exist on the second floor, and then he looked at Pellegrino, and something passed between them that was the compressed negotiation of 2 men deciding that whatever this was, it wasn't worth what it would cost. And then they were past Luca, and through the door and down the stairs, and their footsteps on the street outside were rapid and then gone. The room was quiet. Luca and Danny. Danny was looking at his own hands, which were open on his knees, palms up, the specific posture of a man who has emptied his pockets and is showing you there's nothing left. "I didn't know they'd take it this far," Danny said. His voice was the same voice from the phone Elena had described. Rough at the joints, worn down to grain. "The shooting at the hotel. That wasn't—" "Caro told me it was going to be a conversation, political, that he was going to—" "I know. The store. The woman." Danny looked up. His eyes were red at the rims, not from crying, but from the specific physical toll of hours of sustained fear and the worst toll of sustained guilt. I gave him the address. I didn't know what he was going to do with it. I should have known. I did know. I just... The children in Joliet, Luca said. Danny's throat moved. He threatened to have the placement reviewed, have them separated. His voice broke at the joint and held, barely. 4 kids. The oldest one is 11. She calls me once a week, every Sunday. He stopped. I know that doesn't... I said I know, Luca said. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair Pellegrino had vacated, which put him at Danny's level, and this was a choice that cost him something visible. The posture of a man who has put himself where he doesn't have the advantage, deliberately, as a statement about what this conversation was, rather than what it could have been. What you did? Luca said. The roots. The political contacts. The list. He looked at his own hands for a moment. There are people who got hurt by that. The Delano contact. His family had to move. You know that. I know that. There's no version of this where that gets undone. I know. And the 11-year-old who calls you on Sundays. Luca paused. She doesn't stop existing because of what you did. The debt and the child are both real. That's the part that doesn't have a clean answer. Danny was looking at him now. Something in his face was working. The calculation of a man who had been waiting for the version of this conversation where the outcome was already decided and finding, in its place, a conversation that was still open, still in motion, and not knowing what to do with the opening. What happens now? Danny said. It wasn't quite a question. You're done in Chicago, Luca said. That's not negotiable. The network, the contacts, any of it. You're out. That's the price. He held Danny's eyes. But you're not... I'm not going to let you disappear into something worse than what you already did, because that doesn't undo anything either. A long silence. There's a man in Milwaukee who owes me a favor, Luca said. Legitimate operation, logistics. He needs people who understand how distribution works and doesn't ask too many questions about how they learned it. He paused. The children in Joliet. I'll make sure the placement is stable. Caro's leverage dies with his operation. The 11-year-old keeps calling someone on Sundays. Danny's jaw was working. He looked at the wall, at the window, at his hands again. Why? He said. Luca looked at him for a long moment. Because someone did it for me once, he said, and I spent a long time trying to deserve it. He stood. I don't know if you'll manage it, but the option's there. He walked to the door. Luca. He stopped but didn't turn. I'm sorry, Danny said. The words had the specific weight of something that had been carried a long time and set down at the wrong moment in the wrong room, which was still the only moment and room available. Luca stood in the doorway for a breath. I know you are, he said. Then he went down the stairs and out into the cold of South Halstead, and Marco was there, and the car was there, and the city was doing what the city did at 1:30 in the morning, which was continuing without apology. And Luca stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the cold air on the cut above his eyebrow and the weight of the room behind him settling into the architecture alongside everything else he'd been carrying for 15 years. He got in the car. West Hubbard, he said. What? She was still in the armchair when he came through the back door. She'd made fresh tea at some point. The mug was warm in her hands, half empty, and the Baldwin was still in her lap, still unopened. And the store around her was doing the specific middle-of-the-night thing where it felt smaller and more essential, like a room that had been distilled to its purpose by the absence of the day's noise. She looked at him when he came in. She looked at his face, reading it the way she read everything. For the thing behind the surface, for the structure of what had happened mapped onto the lines of a face she'd been learning for weeks. He was tired. Not the bone-deep tired from earlier, so something different. The tired that comes after a thing has been finished, and the body doesn't yet know what to do with the absence of the weight. Danny? She said. Milwaukee, he said. Eventually. She absorbed that. And the children in Joliet. Handled. She looked at him for a moment, at the whole of him, the jacket, the cut, the hands at his sides, the way he was standing in the doorway of her store's back room at 1:30 in the morning, with nowhere else he'd chosen to be. Sit down, she said. He sat in the chair across from hers. He picked up the cold mug from the desk and held it without drinking, the way he'd held the mug earlier, using the weight of it. They sat in the quiet for a while. "She calls every Sunday," Elena said eventually. "The girl in Joliet." "Every Sunday for 2 years. That's a lot of Sundays." "Yes." She looked at the books on the shelves around them, the organized density of them, the specific gravity of rooms full of stories, all those people between covers wanting something badly enough to change. She thought about what she'd said to him in the early weeks. Someone wants, someone changes, everything else is decoration. And she thought about how little she'd understood when she'd said it, what the decoration cost. "You could have let it go differently tonight," she said. "Yes, you chose not to." "I did." She looked at him. "Why?" He looked at the mug in his hands. He was quiet for a long enough moment that she understood he was answering rather than deflecting, that the silence was the processing, not the avoidance. "But because someone once looked at me when no one else would," he said, "and I spent a long time not knowing what to do with that. Carrying it like a debt I didn't know how to pay." He set the mug down carefully on the desk. "I think I've been making payments toward something. I didn't have a name for it until recently." She felt the sentence land in her chest with the specific weight of something that had been in the air between them for weeks and had just been said directly. "The children's homes," she said. "That's part of it. The families in the neighborhoods. That too." She held his eyes. "And this. And this," he said. "Yes." The heating system ticked. The city outside moved through its unremarkable hour. She reached across the space between the chairs and took his hand the way she'd taken it across the kitchen table. The choice in it, the deliberateness. He looked at their hands and then at her face, and she saw the rawness again, not fractured this time, not under pressure, just present. The expression of a man who had spent 15 years in rooms where care was a liability and had arrived, improbably, in a room where it wasn't. "What do you want?" she asked. "Not Caro, not the network, not any of it." She kept her voice even. "What do you actually want?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she let it be long, didn't push into it. "Something smaller," he said finally, "than what I've built." He looked at the shelves around them. "Something that doesn't require all of it, all the weight of it." His thumb moved against the back of her hand, small and unconscious. "I don't know how to build that. I don't know if I know how to be a person who builds that." You read Hammett and Highsmith and Baldwin in a bookstore armchair and ask questions about what it means to want to be good, Elena said. You already know how to want it. The building is just the rest. His mouth moved. The almost smile, closer than it had ever been, and this time it completed itself. Not large, not performed, just real, the way a door opens when the right key has been in the lock long enough. She smiled back. They sat in the back room of the Marginalia on West Hubbard Street while the city's winter moved through its dark middle hours, and neither of them was in a hurry to be anywhere else, and the quiet around them was the good kind, the earned kind, the kind that only exists on the other side of something difficult. Spring came. The way spring came in Chicago, which was without apology and without gentleness, a hard tilt from cold to something that couldn't decide if it was warm yet, but was committed to the attempt. The store changed with the season the way the store always changed. The light through the front windows going from the flat silver of winter to something with more yellow in it. The regulars shifting from heavy coats to the uncertain layers of people who didn't quite trust the temperature yet. Gerald came every Saturday for his large print mystery. The distributor continued to be intermittently unreasonable. The register jammed on the third Tuesday of the month, with the reliability of a minor biological function. Margaret had not asked. In the months since November, she had managed the extraordinary discipline of running her store, watching the changes in it, the back armchair, the second mug that appeared some mornings, the particular way Elena moved through the space differently, with a kind of ballast she hadn't had before, without once asking a direct question. She had instead communicated everything she needed to communicate through the medium of having good coffee ready at the right times and the occasional strategic placement of a relevant book on Elena's desk. In March, she left a copy of a Graham Greene novel on the desk with a post-it note that said, "You were right about him." Elena turned the note over. On the back, in Margaret's handwriting, "I'm glad." She put the note in her pocket and kept it. Luca's transformation was not sudden and was not simple and was not the kind of story that had a clean line between before and after. That was the thing about real change, Elena had come to understand. It didn't announce itself, it accumulated. It arrived in the small recalibrations of daily things, in the decisions that didn't make headlines because they were too quiet, too internal to be visible from the outside. He stepped back from the operational core of the network over 6 months, transitioning its management through a structure that Marco had helped him build over the years in the background. The legitimate scaffolding that had always been there and had always been the thing he'd told himself he'd get to. He got to it. The political relationships were rebuilt on cleaner terms. Alderman Brooks, it turned out, was relieved enough by the removal of Caro's pressure to be genuinely useful in ways he hadn't been when the relationship was structured around obligation. The children's homes continued. The one in Joliet had a new roof by April, funded through a charitable trust that Luca set up with a name Elena had suggested. Not his name, not a name that pointed anywhere, just a name. She'd suggested it on a Tuesday morning in February when he'd shown her the paperwork, and she'd read it carefully the way she read everything and said, "The name should be something about starting over, something that doesn't carry weight." He'd looked at the form for a moment, then he'd written, "The Margin Foundation." She'd looked at it. "That's the bookstore." Yes. She hadn't said anything else. She hadn't needed to. The last piece of it, the last thread that needed closing, was a phone call she made herself on a Sunday morning in April, when the light through her apartment window was finally doing something honest. The children's home in Joliet had a coordinator named Sister Patricia, who was not, Elena was careful to note, a religious figure in the story she was living, but simply a woman who ran a home for 4 children who needed stability and received it. Elena had called twice before, both times for logistical reasons. This time she called because she wanted to ask about the Sunday calls. "The girl," Elena said. "Sophia, is she still—" "Every week," the coordinator said. 7 o'clock, she's at the phone. She's been asking about him. About why the calls stopped. Yes. Elena was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window, at the April light. "He made arrangements," she said, "for the placement. The funding is stable. The situation that was threatening it, that's resolved." "I know," the coordinator said. "We got the notice. But Sophia, she doesn't know about funding. She knows about Sunday calls." Elena held the phone for a moment. "I'll tell him," she said. She did. Luca looked at her when she said it. The full look. The one that had become simply how he looked at her, without the armor and without the assessment. Just present. "I don't know if she'd—" he started. "She's 11, Elena said. "She calls every Sunday at 7 o'clock. She's been doing it for 2 years. She held his eyes. "That's not obligation. That's love. It doesn't know how to process a sudden absence without an explanation." He was quiet. "You don't have to be who you were," she said. "But you don't have to disappear from the things you built either." The following Sunday at 7:04, his phone rang. Elena was in the kitchen of his apartment. They'd been navigating the geography of 2 lives carefully, without forcing the timeline. And she was here on this particular Sunday because she'd wanted to be, and he hadn't asked her to leave, and neither of them was counting the nights anymore because counting had stopped being necessary. And she heard him pick up, heard the change in his voice, the thing that happened to it when the armor was simply not required. "Hey, kid," he said. And she went back to her tea and the book she was reading and the particular Sunday morning quiet of a life that was different from the one she'd had in November and was also, in its essentials, the same. Still her, still steady, still finding the world manageable in the margin between too much and enough. The neighborhood where Luca had grown up in Bridgeport had a park that had been, for most of his life, the kind of park that existed on maps but not in practice. Too much broken glass, too much history of being used for things that parks weren't for, the playground equipment rusting at the joints and the benches colonized by everything except people who wanted to sit in a park. By the fall, it wasn't that anymore. It had been a quiet process. City funding through channels that Alderman Brooks had facilitated. A community organization that had been trying to get traction on the project for 3 years and had suddenly found the traction there. A construction crew that had worked through July and August and finished in September with the particular pride of people who'd built something where nothing was before. Elena walked through it on a Saturday afternoon in October, almost exactly a year from the gala, from the marble staircase, from the powerful arms that had caught her before she'd understood she was falling. The trees had gone to their autumn colors, and the grass was still holding against the first cold, and children were doing what children did in parks, running without purpose, toward and away from each other with the pure physics of small people in open space. Luca was beside her. They'd walked from the car without hurrying, without agenda, the way they'd learned to move through spaces together over the past year. Her pace and his, neither accommodating the other because accommodation implied hierarchy, and they'd arrived at something more lateral than that, more honest. She watched a small girl, maybe 5, chase a slightly larger boy around the base of a new climbing structure, with the absolute focus of someone who has decided this is the most important thing happening anywhere. "The city looks different," she said. "It is different. From here, specifically." He looked at the park. She watched him look at it. The boy from Bridgeport behind the man he'd become. Both of them real, both of them present, the same eyes reading the same park with different histories attached to what they saw. "I used to cut through the back corner on the way to school," he said. "There was a section of fence you could get through if you were small enough. I stopped being small enough when I was 12 and had to go around for a year before someone fixed it." "Was it you? Who fixed the fence?" He looked at her. The almost smile, which wasn't almost anymore, which had been a complete thing for months, worn in now, habitual, the way a door swings easily once the hinges have been used enough. "What do you think?" he said. "I think it was you," she said. "I think you were 13 and you fixed it because you remembered being 12 and going around and you didn't want the next kid to have to." He looked at the climbing structure. "It was a Saturday. I had wire and pliers from a job my father had left in the garage. 13 years old. I didn't want anyone to know." "You never want anyone to know," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The October light was doing its specific best. Low, honest, the kind of light that didn't flatter or romanticize but simply illuminated, which was better than flattery when what you wanted was to see clearly. "You know," he said. "I know what I've learned," she said. "I'm still learning." His hand found hers between them, the same motion as across kitchen tables and in back rooms of bookstores and on a backseat drive through the November city, the weight of it steady and familiar, and still, somehow, with the quality of something chosen rather than simply present. They walked. The park moved around them, the children and the trees, and the October afternoon and the city beyond the fence doing what it always did, continuing, indifferent, vast, making no particular accommodation for the people inside it and their small, difficult, necessary work of building things where nothing was before. A girl running past nearly collided with Elena's legs, course-corrected without breaking stride, disappeared into the general chase. Elena watched her go. "I fell down a staircase because of you," she said. "You fell down a staircase and I happened to be standing there." "That's not the version I remember." "What's the version you remember?" She looked at him, at the scar at the corner of his mouth, the line of the jaw, the dark eyes that weren't exhausted in the way they'd been when she'd first looked directly into them. Not rested exactly. People like Luca didn't rest in the ordinary sense. The watchfulness was structural, but different, carrying different weight. The weight of someone who had put some things down and picked up different things in their place. "I was at the top of the staircase counting to stay calm," she said, "and someone pushed me slightly, and I fell. And the most feared man in Chicago caught me before I hit the ground." She paused. "And then he stood at the bottom of that staircase holding me like I was the only fragile thing he'd ever been trusted with." He was quiet. "And then he bought 3 Hammett novels," she said, "and asked questions that weren't about plot." "That's a better version," he said. "It's the true one." He stopped walking. She stopped too because their hands were still connected and the stop was his, and she let it be. He looked at her in the October park, in the neighborhood he'd grown up in the middle of the afternoon on an ordinary Saturday, and the expression on his face was the one she had no name for still, the thing that was past the rawness, past the fractured openness, past all the stages she'd watched it move through over the past year. The thing that was simply him, the complete version, unguarded, unarmored, the man who read Baldwin in armchairs and fixed fences on Saturday mornings, and funded homes for children, and had been waiting, for longer than either of them had understood, for someone who would look at the receipt paper and the almost smile and the questions about what it meant to want to be good, and see him clearly. "I caught you," he said. "Yes." "And you didn't let go?" "No," she said. "I didn't." The city moved around them, vast and ongoing. The children ran. The October light continued its low, honest work. And somewhere across that city, in a bookstore on West Hubbard Street, an armchair sat by the window with an indentation in it that had become permanent with use, and a shelf of books that held the record of a year in their worn spines and their turned-down corners, and their margins filled with the small evidence of being read by someone who had found, in the particular quiet of a room full of stories, something he hadn't been looking for, and had, without knowing how, kept. Elena Hartwell squeezed his hand. Luca Moretti squeezed back. They stood in the park in Bridgeport in the fall, and the story they were in had finished the hard part, and what was left, the length of it, the ordinary accumulated texture of it, the work of building something where nothing was before, stretched out ahead of them in every direction. They walked.